Hi and welcome back. Though if this happens to be your very first night here with me, then welcome truly. I am glad you found this quiet little corner of the internet. Wherever you are pressing play from tonight, a bedroom with the covers already pulled up, a dark living room with everyone else asleep, or maybe just your phone propped against a pillow, go ahead and get yourself properly settled in. Because tonight we're not staying anywhere close to home. Tonight we're sinking all the way down past the edge of anything familiar into an ocean that disappeared long before oceans had names. Before we go anywhere else tonight, here's something worth sitting with for a moment. For well over 100 years, some of the most respected scientists on Earth stared at the exact same fossil and could not agree on one simple thing. Not its age, not its diet, just which end of the animal they were even looking at. Tonight you're about to meet the creature that outsmarted them for a century and eventually forced science to rewrite what the word shark actually means. Now before we drift into that story properly, let's take care of one another for just a moment the way people do before settling in for something good. If strange ancient mysteries like this one are exactly the sort of thing you love falling asleep to, then a quiet tap on that subscribe button would mean more than the little number ever shows. It cost you nothing, and it simply tells me you would like more evenings like this one. A like helps too more than you would probably guess. And if your eyes are not too heavy yet, leave a comment and tell me where you are tonight, and what time it happens to be, where you are curled up. I go through every single one of them, and there is something quietly comforting about knowing exactly which corners of the world are drifting off to the very same strange story together without ever meeting. Alright, let's set the mood properly now. Dim the lights if you are able to. Maybe switch on a fan or anything with a soft steady hum, something to turn this room into its own small private world. Get comfortable, because where we're headed tonight, comfort is going to matter more than usual. Let's begin. Picture an ocean with no name yet because there is no one alive to name it. This is not the world you know. The continents have not spread apart the way they appear on your maps. Instead, nearly every scrap of land on Earth has been crushed together into one single restless shape, and wrapped around it is one single endless sea. Scientists will eventually call that landmass Pangaea, and the water surrounding it Panthalassa, but none of that matters, yet not tonight. Tonight it is simply water warm along its shallow edges, freezing and black in its depths, and far, far older than anything you could reasonably compare it to. Somewhere around 270 million years ago, long before the first dinosaur ever took a single breath, long before birds or flowers or anything remotely resembling a human being, this ocean is already full of life, just none of it familiar to you. Strange armoured fish drift near the seafloor. Coral-like creatures build quiet cities out of stone, one calcium layer at a time. And moving above all of it, patrolling the open water the way a landlord walks a property it already knows it owns, is something with quiet, unhurried confidence. Every so often its shadow alone is enough to send an entire school of smaller fish scattering in every direction at once, the way a single set of headlights can empty a quiet street back home. It is long. Longer than you would expect from anything moving that smoothly easily. Longer than the average car back home, close enough in length to a small school bus that if it ever surfaced beside a boat, no one on board would reach for a camera first. They would reach for the nearest thing they could hold on to. At first glance, it barely seems dangerous. A long dark shape gliding low along a reef, patient, almost lazy, the way something moves when it has never once had to worry about being someone else's meal. Somewhere ahead of it, a soft-bodied creature drifts near the rocks, an ancient cousin of the squid, its shell coiled tight, its tentacles trailing behind it, like ribbons caught in the current, completely unaware that it has already been noticed. The shape below does not rush, it simply turns. For a few long seconds nothing happens at all, just the slow drift of current, the faint pulse of gills, the kind of stillness that if you have ever gone quiet in the woods and felt something watching you from the trees, you already understand in your bones. Then without any warning the water folds inward, and the distance between hunter and prey simply disappears, and for one brief moment, right as its jaw opens, the pale light filtering down from the surface catches the inside of its mouth. What is there should not be possible. Not two neat rows of teeth the way you would expect from any ordinary hunter. Not a scattering of jagged points, but a spiral. A tight, coiled, almost hypnotic wheel of teeth, curling in on itself again and again, closer to something a jeweler might design than anything nature is supposed to grow on its own. If you were somehow floating right there beside it, your very first thought probably would not even be fear. It would be confusion. Because nothing about that shape makes sense to a modern eye. It looks less like part of a living animal and far more like a tool or a weapon someone forged with a strange, cruel elegance, and then almost as an afterthought attached to a living, breathing creature. That spiral is the very last thing a great many soft, unlucky animals will ever see right before they are drawn almost gently into the dark. And then just as quietly as it appeared, the shape sinks back down toward the reef, and the ocean closes over it again, as if none of it had happened at all. No name, no witness, no one keeping score. Just one more quiet, ordinary afternoon in a world that will not have a single human being in it for a very, very long time. Now let's leave that ocean behind for a moment. Let's move forward quickly the way you might flip through the pages of a very long, very strange book, past an extinction so severe it will one day erase nearly everything alive in these waters, past the rise and eventually the fall of dinosaurs that have not even been born yet, past the slow crawl of the first mammals, the first flowers opening for the first time, entire ice ages arriving and melting away, past the birth of the very first cities, the first ships, the first maps of the world, all the way forward hundreds of millions of years later to a cold, quiet stretch of hills on the other side of the world where this story truly begins for us. It is the final years of the 1800s. In a rocky, unglamorous corner of the Ural Mountains in what is then the Russian Empire, a man crouches beside a slab of freshly broken stone. This is quarry work, plain and repetitive, the kind that leaves your knees aching and your fingers permanently stained with pale dust. His hands are cold, roughened by hours of outdoor labour, and thin gloves that never seem to help much. The light is thin and grey, the kind that never quite decides whether it wants to rain. Somewhere behind him, other workers are calling out to one another, the dull clink of tools against rock echoing off the hillside, and underneath it all that damp mineral smell that clings to any stone freshly broken open for the first time in millions of years. Fossils are not rare here. Everyone on this hillside has pocketed a few odd shells or curious impressions before tossed them aside, thought nothing more of them. Curious rocks are simply part of the job, the same way splinters are part of working with wood. So there is no real reason for this particular piece still resting in his palm, pulled free from a slab of stone that split apart cleanly under his hammer to make him pause. And yet somehow it does. A small coiled, disc-shaped fossil faintly ridged along its surface, almost pretty in an odd sort of way, the kind of thing you might find washed up on a beach and mistake for an unusually large, unusually strange seashell. He turns it over once then again, brushing away the loose grit with his thumb. It is heavier than it looks, cold even through his gloves. He holds it up toward the grey afternoon light, half expecting the shape to make more sense from a different angle. It does not. He has absolutely no idea what he is holding. He does not know it once belonged inside a living mouth. He does not know it hunted through a warm ancient sea long before there was anyone around to be afraid of it. He certainly has no idea that this single object small enough to fit inside 2 cupped hands is about to spend the next 100 years quietly humiliating some of the finest scientific minds in the world. For now, he simply slips it into his coat pocket the way you might pocket an unusually interesting stone on a walk, planning to show it to someone later who might actually know what it is. And here is the strange, almost funny part of this story. The people who eventually study this fossil will not be careless or lazy or unqualified. They will be brilliant, careful, deeply respected in their fields, the kind of scientists whose names carry weight in any room they walk into. And for well over a century they will still get it wrong again and again in ways that would almost be funny if they had not been trying so hard, so sincerely to get it right. At different points in different decades, they will place that spiral on the tip of a nose like some sort of prehistoric unicorn. They will hang it off the very end of a tail, swinging it like a weapon in old illustrations that still survive today. They will pin it onto the back like some kind of ornamental crest, mostly because by that point that was the only place left where the shape almost seemed to make sense to them. Museum visitors decades apart will stand in front of completely different reconstructions of the very same animal, none of which look anything alike, and every single one of which is confidently wrong. Children will grow up, become parents themselves, and bring their own children back to see an entirely new version of the same creature, redrawn once again, still just as uncertain as the last one. If you had asked any of these very intelligent people to simply admit out loud that they had absolutely no idea what they were looking at, most of them would have found that far harder than guessing wrong in public one more time. It will take a dusty archive, a small museum in the middle of the western United States, an artist who simply refuses to let the mystery go, and eventually a hospital-grade scanning machine built for an entirely different purpose to finally reveal where that spiral truly belonged all along. But that part of the story is still waiting decades away for people who have not been born yet. Right now, back in the cold hills of the Urals, none of that has happened yet. Right now, there is only a tired man, a strange and beautiful stone sitting heavy in his coat pocket, and a single question that no one on earth can answer for him yet. He has no way of knowing it, standing there in the failing light with cold hands and a long walk still ahead of him, but he's about to hand the scientific world one of the strangest puzzles it has ever tried to solve. Not a monster, not a myth, just a small, quiet, honest piece of stone patiently waiting for anyone to finally understand it. So let's rewind the clock just a little further and stand right there beside him, in the cold, in the failing light, at the exact moment this whole mystery begins. The walk down from the quarry that evening feels longer than usual, though the man could not quite tell you why. Maybe it is the weight of the stone still sitting in his coat pocket, small as it actually is. Maybe it is simply the cold settling deeper into his knuckles with every step. The gravel path is slick from the day's earlier rain, and somewhere off in the distance a dog is barking at nothing. In particular, the way dogs in small towns often seem to do right around dusk. Either way, by the time he reaches the small cluster of houses at the bottom of the hill, he has already decided something. He's not going to leave this particular stone sitting on a windowsill to gather dust the way so many other odd little rocks from these quarries usually do. Here is something worth knowing about this stretch of the Ural Mountains in case you've never had a reason to think about it before tonight. Quarries scattered across these hills near a small town called Krasnofimsk had been turning up strange fossils for years by this point. Most of them meant nothing at all to the men swinging the hammers. A curious shell here, an odd ridge of stone there. Interesting enough for a passing comment, maybe worth showing a friend over dinner, and then almost always forgotten by the following week. But every so often one of these stones finds its way into different hands entirely. That is more or less what happens with this one. It passes quite likely through more than one set of hands until it eventually reaches a naturalist and collector named Alexander Besnov, a man with the patience and frankly the stubbornness to actually take these small regional oddities seriously. Besnov has been gathering pieces like this for a while, by then turning them over, comparing them against whatever fossils he already recognizes, and slowly building a quiet suspicion that something about these particular spirals does not fit anywhere in his existing collection. So he does the only sensible thing a serious collector in his position could do. He packages up the best examples he has, and he sends them off hundreds of miles away toward the one city in the entire Russian Empire where somebody might actually be able to explain what he is looking at. St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg at the very end of the 1800s is not just any city. It is the beating intellectual heart of an empire that stretches across most of a hemisphere, a place built almost entirely on ambition, canals modelled after Amsterdam, grand stone buildings modelled after Paris and Rome, and scientific institutions the Crown had spent nearly 2 centuries trying to turn into the envy of Europe. It is, in other words, about as far removed from a dusty quarry road in the Urals as this fossil could possibly travel, and yet that is exactly where it is headed. It is also worth pausing on Besnov himself for just a moment, because men like him rarely get remembered properly in stories like this one. In an era before every corner of the natural world had already been catalogued by well-funded professional teams, a surprising amount of scientific discovery depended entirely on people exactly like him. Local doctors, school teachers, mining engineers with a curious streak that never quite left them. Amateur naturalists scattered across a vast, largely unmapped empire, quietly filling spare rooms with private collections, occasionally stumbling onto something that would outlast their own names by well over a century. Besnov is one of thousands of people doing this kind of quiet, unglamorous work across Russia at the time. He simply happens to be the one holding the right stone. Try to picture that journey for a second, because it is worth picturing properly. A fossil that spent nearly 270 million years sitting silently underground, in complete darkness, without a single living witness, now rattling along inside a wooden crate on the back of a cart, and then a train crossing an empire so vast that the sun rises and sets more than once before that crate ever reaches its destination. It is in its own strange way one of the longer road trips in the entire history of paleontology. Waiting at the far end of that journey is a man who by the final years of the 1800s is already one of the most respected geologists anywhere in the Russian Empire. His name is Alexander Kopinski, and if you take away nothing else from tonight, take this. By the time this fossil reaches his desk, he already leads the country's geological committee, already holds a seat at the Academy of Sciences, and has already produced the first complete geological map of European Russia, the kind of map industry's railway planners and mining companies would go on leaning on for decades. Colleagues have started quietly referring to him as something close to the father of Russian geology, a nickname that tends to get handed out rather sparingly in academic circles. Decades later, he will go on to become the first elected president of that very academy, a position he will hold for the rest of his life. But none of that has happened yet. Right now he is simply a busy, well-respected scientist, unwrapping yet another parcel of unidentified fossils sent in by yet another provincial collector, most likely expecting nothing particularly unusual. He is about to be wrong. When Kopinski lays the fragments out across his desk, here is roughly what greets him. Several coiled disc-shaped pieces similar to the one still sitting in a quarry worker's pocket, hundreds of miles away though noticeably better preserved, ridged, compact, curling tightly in on themselves in that same hypnotic spiral shape, and his very first instinct, by every account that survives, is not far off from where our story left off a few minutes ago. He thinks shell. Now, before you judge him too harshly for that, consider the world Karpinski actually works in. This exact region of Russia is bursting with the fossilized remains of ancient marine mollusks, spiral-shelled cousins of the octopus and squid, known as ammonoids, alongside their older, equally coiled relatives, the nautiloids. If you have ever seen a nautilus shell, the smooth, pale, spiral kind, sometimes sold in seaside gift shops, or sliced neatly in half to show off that perfect chambered spiral inside, you already have a rough picture of what Karpinski is used to pulling out of these rocks. Except in his case, multiply that image by the hundreds spread across an entire career. Karpinski has personally handled more of these coiled shells than he could probably count, and his trained eye has spent decades sharpening one very reliable shortcut. Coiled shape curling inward, ridged surface equals shell. That is not a foolish assumption on his part. It is an efficient one, built on real expertise, the same kind of pattern recognition that lets any true expert move quickly instead of re-examining every single rock from scratch, as though they had never seen a fossil before in their life. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, and I mean that honestly, not just as a passing line to fill space. Have you ever picked something up, something perfectly ordinary looking, and felt completely certain you already knew exactly what it was, only to realize later that your very first assumption had quietly led you somewhere wrong? Karpinski's mistake, if you can even fairly call it a mistake, yet is a deeply human one. We're all, every single one of us, pattern-matching machines. We see a shape and our mind reaches instantly for the nearest familiar drawer to file it into, often before we've actually finished looking at it properly. But something about these particular fossils refuses to sit quietly in that drawer. Because the closer Karpinski looks, the less sense the shell explanation actually makes. For one thing, there is no shell material here, not in the way he would expect. Mollusk shells are built in soft layered sheets, formed gradually from the inside outward, the way a pearl slowly forms around a tiny piece of grit inside an oyster. What sits on his desk is nothing like that at all. Under closer inspection, with a hand lens pressed near the ridge surface, what he is actually looking at are individual hardened points, each one clearly its own separate structure packed snugly against the ones beside it. Not one continuous shell. Never was. Karpinski spends hours bent over that desk, a magnifying lens pressed close to the stone, sketching what he sees onto paper by hand, the way any careful scientist of that era would long before anyone could simply photograph a specimen and move on. He counts. He recounts just to be sure the first count was not a mistake. He writes small, careful notes in the margins, the kind of notes meant only for himself, questions he cannot yet answer, comparisons he is not yet confident enough to make out loud. Teeth. Dozens of them. In the more complete specimens, Besanoff has sent along well over 150 individual teeth, arranged one after another in a single continuous coil, each one slightly larger than the last, all curling inward toward a small, tightly coiled center. This was never a shell. At some point, quite literally, this was a mouth. And that single realization changes absolutely everything about the question Karpinski now has to answer, because a coiled shell simply resting on a seafloor requires no real explanation. Shells are common. Shells are expected. A mouth built entirely out of one continuous cochlea-shaped wheel of teeth, with no obvious opening, no hinge that makes any immediate sense. No fair comparison anywhere in the natural world he has studied so far. That is an entirely different kind of problem altogether. If this was a mouth, then some living, breathing hunting animal once carried this exact structure around inside its own head and actually used it somehow to eat. And whatever that creature turns out to be, Nothing quite like it has ever been formally described before, not by Karpinski, not by anyone else working anywhere in the world at that time. There is something quietly beautiful and admittedly a little bit funny about this precise moment in the story. Here is a man surrounded by some of the finest scientific literature available anywhere on Earth, an academy member, a department director, someone whose professional judgment quietly shapes how an entire empire understands its own geology, and he is sitting there turning a 270-million-year-old spiral of teeth over in his hands, essentially forced to admit that he has absolutely no idea what animal it once belonged to. No textbook covers this. No colleague down the hall has seen one before. No shortcut left to reach for this time. Science. Real science rarely looks like the confident, tidy version most of us picture in our heads, the calm expert instantly announcing the answer under bright museum lighting. More often, it looks exactly like this. A tired, respected professional alone at a cluttered desk on a cold afternoon, quietly admitting to himself that the drawer he normally reaches for simply does not exist yet. I think we tend to prefer the cinematic version of discovery, the sudden gasp, the dramatic realization, because it makes for a cleaner story. But almost nothing about real scientific progress happens that way. It happens in exactly this kind of quiet, patient, mostly unglamorous stretch of hours, the kind that never makes it into a headline, and yet without which none of the headlines would exist at all. To his credit, Karpinski does not shrug and set the fossils aside. He does the one thing that actually separates good scientists from everyone else, confidently guessing from the sidelines. He commits to figuring this out properly, cataloguing every fragment, measuring every visible tooth, comparing them against every remotely similar specimen he can track down anywhere in Europe, before he ever puts his own name and reputation behind an official answer. That process alone takes him the better part of a year. In his official paper, Karpinski does not even grant this creature its own separate identity right away. He first sets it beside a small family of already known, equally strange, cutting-toothed fossil fish before eventually deciding that what sits in front of him is different enough, unusual enough to deserve an entirely new category, built just for this animal and nothing else. When Karpinski finally does put a name to this strange coiled wonder sitting in front of him, he publishes his findings first in Russian for his own scientific community, and then that very same year in German as well, so the rest of Europe's scientific circles have no excuse to overlook what he has found. By pure coincidence, that same year also happens to be the year he is elected president of the Russian Mineralogical Society. One small, tidy irony in a career built almost entirely around identifying rocks correctly now, forever tied to the one fossil that for the moment refuses to be identified at all. And the name he lands on is one still being used tonight in this very story you're listening to. A name built from two simple old ideas stitched together, spiral and saw. But naming a mystery, satisfying as it might feel in the moment, is not remotely the same thing as solving it. Have you ever solved half of a problem, felt that small rush of relief that comes with finally understanding one piece of something difficult, only to realize the actual puzzle was still sitting there, completely untouched, waiting for you? That is more or less where Karpinski finds himself. He has a name. He has a rough idea of what family this animal might belong to. What he does not have, not even close, is any real sense of what this creature actually looked like while it was alive. Naming this animal, it turns out, is the easy part. Figuring out exactly where on its actual living body that terrifying spiral of teeth once sat, whether it curled outward from the front of its face, hung from somewhere else entirely, or belonged in a place no one had even seriously considered. Yet that particular puzzle is about to consume the careers of several respected scientists for the next few decades. And right now, Sitting at his desk with a year of careful study behind him, Alexander Karpinski is about to take the very first guess. It will not be the last one, and it will not, as it turns out, be the right one either. Here's something that almost nobody thinks about right up until the exact moment it actually matters, and tonight it matters quite a lot. Reach up just for a second and touch the tip of your own nose. Now touch the top of your ear. Notice how both of them bend slightly under your fingers, how neither one feels quite as solid as, say, your forehead or your jaw. That soft, bendable material is called cartilage, and you're carrying a surprising amount of it around inside your own body right now, holding certain shapes together without ever hardening into true bone. Sharks and their stranger, lesser-known relatives are built almost entirely out of that same soft material. Not a single true bone anywhere in their bodies. No solid skull the way you or I would picture one. No rigid rib cage. Just cartilage, flexible, lightweight, remarkably efficient for moving through water, and for anyone trying to study one that died 270 million years ago, absolutely disastrous. It is a strange kind of trade-off if you think about it. That same softness is part of why sharks and their relatives move the way they do, quick, silent, almost weightless, compared to a fish built around a heavy internal frame of bone. Evolution handed them speed and flexibility in exchange for something they were never going to need while alive, and something that would only ever matter to strangers studying their remains hundreds of millions of years later. Nature, it turns out, does not plan ahead for paleontologists. Here is why that matters so much to our story tonight. Bone-real bone is dense and mineral-rich, and under the right conditions it can survive burial for an extraordinarily long time, slowly turning to stone over millions of years while still holding its original shape. Cartilage almost never gets that privilege. It is too soft, too easily broken down by bacteria, too quick to simply dissolve away, long before the surrounding sediment has any real chance to harden around it. In the overwhelming majority of cases when an ancient shark or one of its relatives dies and settles onto the seafloor, its entire skeleton simply disappears quietly within a matter of years. There is exactly one part of that skeleton hard enough, mineral-rich enough to reliably survive: teeth. If someone handed you a single tooth right now, just one, and asked you to describe the entire living animal, it once belonged to its size, its shape, the way it hunted, what would you even say? Where would you begin? That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is quite literally the job Karpinski is about to take on. So think for a moment about what that actually means for everything that survives in fossil form from every shark and shark relative that has ever lived on this planet. In the overwhelming majority of cases when scientists say they have found one, what they have actually found is a scattering of teeth, sometimes many, sometimes only a handful, almost never anything else. If you have ever heard people talk about the enormous prehistoric shark called Megalodon, and pictured that animal with total confidence in your head, here is something worth knowing. Everything we have ever built, that picture from the size, estimates, the illustrations, the entire popular idea of what that creature looked like comes almost entirely from teeth along with a small number of partial vertebrae. Not one complete megalodon skeleton has ever been found. Not one. Every size estimate you've ever heard for that animal, some of them stretching well beyond the length of a city bus, comes from scientists carefully measuring a handful of fossilized teeth, then scaling those measurements up using the tooth-to-body ratio of its closest living relative, the great white shark, and hoping the comparison holds. It is an educated, defensible estimate. It is still, at the end of the day, an estimate built on teeth alone. Scientists are still quietly debating certain details of that animal's exact body shape today, for essentially the same reason you are about to watch play out with our own creature tonight. Karpinski, sitting at his desk in St. Petersburg with a spiral of well over 150 teeth in front of him, does not have the luxury of even a partial skeleton to lean on, or a single vertebra. He has the teeth, and only the teeth. No skull, no jawbone holding them in place, no fin, no spine, no scrap of the body that once carried this structure around through the water. It would be a little like being handed one single gear from a machine nobody has ever seen before, a machine with no name, no manual, no other surviving parts anywhere on Earth, and being given strict instructions to describe in careful detail exactly what the entire machine looked like, how it moved, and what it was originally built to do. You could study that one gear for years. You could measure every tooth on its edge, note every scratch, every sign of wear. None of it would tell you with any real certainty whether it once belonged inside a pocket watch or the engine of a locomotive. Have you ever tried to guess the whole shape of something from just one small piece of it? A single puzzle piece with no box, no picture printed on the front to guide you. No real idea how many total pieces are supposed to exist. That essentially is the exact position Karpinski finds himself in. And yet remarkably, he does not simply throw up his hands and refuse to guess. This is precisely why an entire branch of paleontology exists almost solely around the study of teeth. Their shape alone can reveal an astonishing amount whether an animal sliced through flesh or crushed through shell, roughly how old it was when it died, sometimes even a rough sense of how quickly it grew throughout its life. Teeth, in other words, are rarely just teeth. They are diaries written in enamel for anyone patient enough to study them properly. By the time his monograph goes to print, Karpinski has settled on an actual specific answer, drawn out carefully in his own illustrations for the wider scientific world to examine. He's by every account a remarkably skilled draftsman himself, the same steady hand that had already produced detailed geological maps, now put to work sketching cross-sections of an animal nobody living had ever actually seen. Careful shading, precise measurements noted in the margins, the kind of illustration meant to persuade not just to describe. And to understand where that particular answer comes from, we have to talk about one more fossil, first a fossil Karpinski already knows quite well by then called Edestus. Edestus belongs to that same strange extended family of ancient cartilage fish, and it is in its own right a deeply unsettling creature to look at. Other scientists of the era had already taken to calling it the scissor-tooth fish, because its jaws carried curved blade-like rows of teeth that met in the middle, the way the two halves of a pair of scissors do, growing longer and more pronounced with age, never shedding, never replaced, simply extending further out of the mouth year after year. By the final years of the 1800s, scientists studying it had already reached an important conclusion of their own. Those bizarre, curved, blade-like teeth were not loose scattered fossils at all. They were part of an actual jaw structure, a real functioning mouth projecting forward in a way no living animal quite manages today. In other words, right before Karpinski ever lays eyes on a Helicoprion tooth whorl, he already carries one working example in his mind, of an ancient cartilage fish that grew its teeth into a strange forward jutting blade. So when this new coiled version arrives on his desk, his mind does something scientists are trained to do constantly, and something, if we are being honest, all of us do every single day without ever really noticing it. He reaches for the closest reasonable comparison already sitting in his memory, and he builds his answer around it. His conclusion, when it finally arrives, goes something like this. The spiral of teeth he proposes curled forward and outward from the upper jaw, projecting past the front of the animal's face the way a blade projects outward from its handle. For a point of comparison, his readers scattered across Europe would immediately understand he turns to a living animal almost everyone already knew, by reputation, if not by sight, the sawfish. If you have never seen one, a sawfish is exactly as striking as it sounds, a long flattened blade extending from the front of its face, sometimes nearly as long as the rest of its own body, lined on both edges with sharp tooth-like points, used for slashing sideways through tightly packed schools of smaller fish before circling back to pick off the wounded stragglers. Sailors and coastal fishing communities across the world had been telling stories about this animal for centuries by the time Karpinski sits down to write his monograph, so it is not some obscure reference he is pulling out for effect. It is a shared, recognizable image, something almost any educated reader of his era could picture instantly. Karpinski's proposal, in essence, imagines something similar, except instead of a flat blade lined with teeth along its outer edges, picture that entire blade curled backward on itself, coiling inward again and again like a watch spring, sitting right at the very front of the animal's upper jaw. It is, when you actually sit with it for a moment, a remarkably clever piece of reasoning. It is not some wild, careless guess pulled out of thin air. It is built on real anatomical precedent, on a fossil he had personally studied for years, on a living animal his entire audience would immediately recognize without any further explanation. Karpinski is not being reckless here. He is doing exactly what a careful scientist is supposed to do, reasoning from the known toward the unknown, one careful step at a time. And this, I think, is worth sitting with for a moment because it says something a little bit larger than just one fossil fish. Some of the most reasonable, most carefully constructed conclusions any of us ever reach in life turn out to be wrong, not because we were careless, but because we were reasoning correctly from an incomplete picture. A doctor examining a set of familiar symptoms and reaching for the most likely explanation. A friend recognizing someone's silhouette from a distance at dusk and calling out entirely the wrong name. Even something as small as tasting one unfamiliar dish and assuming, based on everything you already know about that particular cuisine, that you know roughly how the rest of the meal is going to taste. None of that makes the reasoning foolish. It simply makes it human. We build our understanding of new things out of pieces of old things, because most of the time that shortcut serves us perfectly well. It is only every so often that we run headfirst into something so entirely unprecedented that the shortcut quietly betrays us. Karpinski publishes his reconstruction with appropriate scientific caution, careful to frame it as his best working theory, rather than a settled fact. He knows better than almost anyone how little he actually has to work with, and to his credit, he says so plainly in his own writing, leaving the door open for whoever comes along next with a better answer. There is an entire vocabulary scientists reach for when they want to sound confident without actually promising too much. Phrases like "the evidence suggests" instead of "this proves," a probable reconstruction instead of the definitive one. Karpinski leans on exactly this kind of careful hedged language throughout his monograph, and if you have ever caught yourself softening a guess in conversation, just enough to leave room to be wrong later, without losing face entirely, you already understand instinctively precisely what he was doing on that page. But once an idea like this leaves one desk in St. Petersburg and enters the wider scientific world, it stops belonging only to the person who first proposed it. Word travels slowly the way it does in an age of printed journals and international mail out toward France, toward England, and eventually across an entire ocean toward the United States. Each copy of his monograph lands on a different desk in a different country, in front of a scientist who has never once held the actual fossil in their own hands and who has to decide, based purely on Karpinski's drawings and his written argument, whether they believe him. Quite a few of them do not. It helps to remember what kind of moment in history this actually is. The final years of the 1800s are, among other things, something close to a golden age for fossil hunting. Across Europe and the United States, a period when new natural history museums are opening their doors in one major city after another, each one racing to fill its galleries with the strangest, most awe-inspiring specimens, money and expedition funding can secure. Paleontology as a serious profession is still relatively young, ambitious, and more than a little bit competitive. A discovery like this one, a truly unclassifiable animal with no obvious modern equivalent, is exactly the kind of puzzle that ambitious scientists hungry to make their own mark on the field cannot resist picking up. And in each of those places, other equally serious, equally respected scientists begin turning this same strange spiral over in their own minds, studying Karpinski's careful illustrations line by line, picking apart his reasoning piece by piece, and one after another quietly deciding that he has gotten it wrong. Not because he was careless, not because his reasoning was poor, simply because a puzzle this strange, it turns out, is about to attract a great many very confident, very different answers scattered across an entire continent and beyond, and almost none of them are going to agree with each other or with him. Karpinski's monograph does not sit quietly on a shelf for very long. Word of it spreads exactly the way Karpinski expected it would, slowly through printed journals, through letters exchanged between institutions, through the small, tightly connected circle of people around the world who take fossilized fish seriously enough to argue about them. Scientific correspondence at the turn of the century moves at the pace of steamships and postal trains, which means an idea can sit quietly for months before anyone on another continent even gets the chance to disagree with it. Publishing a monograph like Karpinski's is not a private act. It is closer to standing up in a crowded room full of your most demanding colleagues and stating in writing permanently exactly what you believe to be true, knowing full well that every single one of them is free to stand up right after you and say otherwise. And within a single year, somebody finally does. His name is Charles Rochester Eastman, an American paleontologist with a reputation for being sharp, thorough, and by more than one account not particularly shy about saying so when he disagreed with someone. By the time this particular review crosses his desk, Eastman has already built a career quietly picking apart other people's fossil interpretations, respected as much for his caution as for his willingness to publicly challenge names far more famous than his own. In 1900, in the pages of an American scientific journal called the American Naturalist, Eastman publishes a formal review of Karpinski's paper under a title that leaves absolutely no doubt about whose work is under the microscope. And here is the interesting part. He is not unkind about the work as a whole. He respects the careful cataloguing, the patient measurements, the sheer scholarly effort Karpinski clearly poured into every page. What Eastman cannot bring himself to accept, however, is Karpinski's actual drawing of the finished animal, the sketch showing that spiral curling forward out of the upper jaw, like some grotesque coiled beard. Eastman looks at that same drawing and sees something else entirely. His argument goes roughly like this. If you take a jaw, any jaw, and hang a rigid cone-shaped spiral off the very front of it, that structure is going to catch the water like a spoon dragged sideways through a bathtub. Every single time the animal opens its mouth to swim forward, that whirl would create enormous drag, constant turbulence, the kind of resistance that would exhaust an animal long before it ever caught anything worth eating. There is something almost satisfying about the simplicity of that objection. You do not need a laboratory to picture it. You just need to imagine trying to swim forward with a dinner plate strapped sideways to your own chin. To Eastman, an efficient predator simply would not be built that way, so he proposes something different. Not a mouth structure at all, a spine. Picture for a moment something closer to the row of defensive plates running down a stegosaurus's back, except built entirely out of interlocking teeth, instead of solid bone sitting somewhere along the upper spine of the animal, positioned just ahead of its dorsal fin. Not for eating, for defense. A visible, unmistakable warning to anything nearby that might otherwise consider this creature an easy meal, in the same way a puffed-up spine-covered fish today makes potential predators think twice before striking, or the way a rattlesnake's tail exists purely to be seen and heard, long before it ever needs to be used. Here's a fair question worth sitting with for a second. If you had to choose right now between those two pictures, a bladed saw curling out of an open mouth, or a jagged ridge of teeth bristling along an animal's spine, which one would feel more believable to you? Because remember, neither man has any actual body to compare it against. Both of them are reasoning entirely from a single, isolated coil of teeth, and building an entire animal around their own best guess. Two intelligent, well-trained minds staring at the exact same object walking away with two completely different animals in their heads. What happens next is, in its own quiet way, one of my favourite details in this whole story. Karpinski reads Eastman's review, and instead of digging in, instead of defending his original sketch out of pride or stubbornness, the man who discovered this animal, who named it, who spent the better part of a year cataloguing every fragment of it, actually changes his mind. Over the following years, he tries out several new positions of his own. At different points, Karpinski suggests the whorl might belong somewhere along the tail. Then he proposes it might extend from the dorsal fin instead. Then later still, he moves it lower down the back, entirely edging closer to Eastman's own thinking with each new attempt. Think about that for a second. The one person on Earth who had spent more hours with this fossil than anyone alive still could not settle on a single confident answer, even after years of study, even with his own name and reputation permanently attached to the animal. That is not a mark against him. If anything, it might be the most honest part of this entire story. A lesser scientist, or perhaps simply a more prideful one, might have spent the rest of his career defending that first sketch out of sheer stubbornness. Karpinski, to his lasting credit, keeps looking instead. Not everyone agrees with the direction Eastman and Karpinski are moving in, though. A Belgian paleontologist named Gustav Simoens takes a very different approach. Belgium at this point in history is hardly a minor player in the world of fossils. Its National Museum already houses one of the most celebrated dinosaur discoveries in the world, an entire herd of iguanodons pulled from a coal mine some years earlier, meticulously reconstructed and put on public display to enormous acclaim. Simoens works within that same serious, well-funded tradition of careful evidence-driven reconstruction, and it shows in how he approaches this particular puzzle. Rather than simply arguing about shapes and sketches from a distance, Simoens does something more painstaking. He slices impossibly thin sections from the teeth themselves, thin enough to place under a microscope, and studies the actual internal structure, layer by layer, comparing what he sees against known dental tissue from other cartilage fish, whose place in the mouth was never in question. It is slow, careful, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely gets remembered decades later, and precisely the kind of work Karpinski himself had modelled for the entire field 2 decades earlier at his own cluttered desk. And based on that evidence, Simoens states with real confidence that whatever this structure was, it belonged inside the animal's mouth, not on its back, not along its tail, inside the mouth, functioning as teeth are supposed to function. So now you have 2 respected camps quietly disagreeing across international borders, each one convinced the other has misread the same object entirely. It does not help matters that in the years following Karpinski's first description, more fragments keep turning up scattered across quarries throughout the Ural region, each one slightly different in overall size, in the exact curl of its spiral in the wear pattern along its edges. Rather than settling the argument, this steady trickle of new material mostly just adds more raw fuel to it. More teeth to measure, more angles to argue about. Still frustratingly no skull, no jaw, No single scrap of surrounding bone or cartilage that might finally anchor the whole debate to something solid. For a good stretch of the early 20th century, if you had opened a serious book about ancient fish, you might find 2, sometimes 3 completely different pictures of this same animal, printed only a few pages apart, each one credited to a different, equally respected author, with no clear indication of which picture, if any, the reader was actually supposed to believe. Imagine handing a curious child, or frankly any of us 3 separate encyclopedias, each one confidently drawing the exact same creature in a completely different way, and being asked to simply pick whichever one felt right. That is roughly the state of things for the better part of half a century. Not ignorance exactly. Something closer to a very well documented, very well argued kind of confusion. This disagreement does not resolve itself quickly. It does not resolve itself, in fact, for decades. Let's jump forward now past World War I, past World War II, all the way to 1952. An entire lifetime has passed since Karpinski first unwrapped that package from Bessonov. The empire Karpinski once served no longer exists at all, replaced by an entirely different kind of country. Karpinski himself has already been gone for more than 15 years, by this point having lived out his final decades exactly the way you might expect of a man once nicknamed the father of an entire scientific discipline, still leading his beloved academy almost until his very last breath. And through all of it, through revolutions, through 2 world wars, through the death of the very man who started this whole conversation, this one small, fossil question simply sits there quietly unresolved, waiting for someone else to pick it back up. A Soviet paleoichthyologist named Dmitry Obrushev sits down to take a fresh, careful look at the whole problem. It does not help that for a long stretch of the 20th century, scientific exchange between his part of the world and everywhere else becomes considerably more difficult borders, tightening specimens and letters no longer moving quite as freely between institutions as they once did in Karpinski's day. Obruchev is in many ways picking up a conversation that the wider scientific world had been having in fragments across closed borders and interrupted correspondence rather than as one continuous discussion. And unlike Eastman, Obruchev actually agrees the whorl probably does belong somewhere near the mouth, but he runs into a different, very reasonable objection of his own. If you put an enormous rigid coil of teeth down in the lower jaw, Obrushev reasons how would the animal ever manage to close its mouth properly? A structure that size sitting in the lower jaw would seem to jam the whole mechanism open or block it from closing at all, the way trying to shut a door with a stack of books wedged in the frame simply will not work, no matter how hard you push. To him, the lower jaw placement does not just seem unlikely, it seems mechanically impossible. So Obrushev proposes something new. He places the whorl in the upper jaw instead, not primarily for feeding, but as a kind of built-in shock absorber, a dense coiled cushion sitting above the animal's mouth, protecting its skull from impact, the way a coiled spring protects the frame of a machine from sudden jolts. It is once again careful, reasoned, thoughtful science. It is also once again wrong. Here is what none of these men, Eastman, Karpinski, in his later years Obruchev, brilliant as every one of them clearly actually has access to. Not one of them has ever seen a single Helicoprion specimen still sitting in its original natural position, still connected even loosely to any surrounding cartilage or bone that might settle the argument once and for all. Every single reconstruction, every drawing, every confident published paper is still built. From the same starting point, Karpinski began with more than half a century earlier. Teeth, only teeth, beautifully preserved, endlessly studied, and completely disconnected from the rest of the animal they once belonged to. I think there is something worth pausing on here, something a little bigger than fossils. Have you ever noticed how much harder it becomes to say, "I don't know," the longer you have spent being the expert? People expect an answer from a teacher 20 years into a career, quietly unsure about a question a student just asked, and reaching for something confident anyway rather than admitting uncertainty out loud. None of these men set out to be stubborn. They were simply doing what serious, respected professionals are trained to do. Reason carefully, publish confidently, defend your position with solid evidence when it is challenged. The trouble is, none of that training prepares you particularly well for the specific uncomfortable feeling of realizing that the evidence itself might simply be incomplete no matter how carefully you reason from it. And there is one more thread quietly running underneath every single guess in this entire chapter of the story one. None of these men ever really stopped to question, buried so deep in their reasoning that it barely even registers as an assumption at all. Eastman pictures a spine on the back of a shark. Karpinski in his later years pictures a fin or a tail on a shark. Simowens argues for a jaw but still assumes it belongs to something broadly shark-shaped. Obruchev pictures a shock-absorbing jaw structure on a shark. Every single competing theory, no matter how different from the others, still starts from the exact same, unquestioned assumption, sitting quietly underneath all of them, that this animal was some kind of shark to begin with. That assumption feels so obvious, so reasonable, sitting right there in the animal's own name spiral, so that almost nobody thinks to seriously challenge it for decades. It is the one piece of the puzzle nobody even realizes they're still guessing at, because it never occurs to them that it needs to be questioned in the first place. It turns out to be wrong too. So if this animal was never actually a shark, what on earth was it? That question sat quietly, mostly unasked, for the better part of a century, buried underneath every single argument about where the tooth whorl belonged. Scientists were so busy fighting over placement jaw, spine, tail, dorsal fin that almost nobody stopped to interrogate the one label everyone had already agreed on without a second thought. Shark. It said so right there in the animal's own name. Spiral saw a name built entirely around the image of a blade, and blades belong to sharks, do they not? Here is where the story takes a turn I truly love telling, because the truth ends up being stranger, and honestly more interesting than the shark label ever was. To understand it properly, we need to talk about a split that happened deep in the family tree of cartilage fish so far back in time that it makes even our 270-million-year-old creature look relatively young by comparison. Somewhere around 400 million years ago, long before anything resembling a modern shark had even evolved. Back when the very first plants were only just beginning to creep out of the water and onto dry land, the ancestors of all cartilage, fish quietly divided into two separate branches. One branch eventually produced every true shark and ray that has ever lived: the great whites, the hammerheads, the gentle whale sharks drifting through warm water today. The other branch went somewhere else entirely, down a much stranger, much quieter evolutionary path, and it is this second, far less famous branch that our creature actually belongs to. To put that timeline in perspective for a moment, these two branches had already been growing apart for well over 100 million years by the time our spiral-toothed hunter was even born. Shark and non-shark as categories were already ancient history before this particular creature ever took its first breath in the water. If sharks are the loud, popular cousin at the family reunion, the one everyone recognizes immediately, this other branch is the relative who barely shows up at all, who lives somewhere remote and unfamiliar, and who almost nobody at the party could actually pick out of a crowd. Before we go any further, it helps to sit with one simple idea because it explains almost everything about why this mistake lasted so long. Looking similar and being related are not actually the same thing at all. A whale and a shark, for example, can glide through the exact same ocean, wearing almost the exact same streamlined silhouette, smooth, torpedo-shaped, built for cutting through water, with as little resistance as possible. And yet one of them is a warm-blooded mammal that breathes air nurses its young and is in evolutionary terms considerably closer to you than it is to any fish in the sea. Nature, faced with the same basic problem moving efficiently through water, keeps arriving at similar-looking solutions again and again using completely different starting materials each time. Biologists have a name for this pattern: convergent evolution. History is full of examples if you know where to look for them. Long before whales existed at all, an entirely different group of ancient marine reptiles called ichthyosaurs evolved a body shape so strikingly similar to a modern dolphin that early fossil hunters occasionally mistook pieces of one for the other, despite the two animals being separated by tens of millions of years and belonging to completely different branches of life altogether. Water rewards a handful of very specific shapes, and evolution, working with whatever raw material happens to be available at the time, keeps stumbling onto those same handful of shapes again and again using dramatically different starting points. And our spiral-toothed hunter, it turns out, is one of its more convincing tricks. Its living members today go by a few different names: chimeras, ratfish, ghost sharks. Some fishing communities simply call them spookfish, which once you actually see one feels like the most honest name of the bunch. Let me paint you a picture of what one of these animals actually looks like, because I think it matters here. Picture something drifting slowly through complete crushing darkness, thousands of feet below the surface of the ocean, in water so far from sunlight that colour itself barely means anything down there anymore. Its body tapers backward into a long, thin, almost whip-like tail, which is exactly why English speakers eventually settled on the name ratfish. Its eyes are enormous, pale, and strangely luminous, built for a world with almost no light to work with at all. Its skin is smooth, not rough, and sandpapery the way a shark's skin famously is, and it moves without any particular hurry the way something moves when it has lived in total darkness for so many millions of years that speed simply stopped mattering to its survival. Very few people alive today have ever seen one of these animals with their own eyes, and honestly that feels appropriate given the company they keep. While their spiral-toothed relative was busy ruling the sunlit Permian seas, above this branch of the family had already quietly retreated into the deep dark water below, and it has mostly stayed down there ever since, patient, unhurried, largely unbothered by whatever happens to the world above the waves. Entire empires have risen and collapsed since then. Ice ages have come and gone, and somewhere in the permanent darkness of the deep ocean, this same quiet lineage has simply kept doing what it has always done, largely unchanged, long after its flashier, shallow water cousins gave up that same lifestyle for something faster and more visible. The very name chimera comes from an old Greek myth, a monster stitched together from mismatched parts, a lion's head, a goat's body, a serpent for a tail, one single creature that should not by any normal logic exist as one unified animal. Whoever first applied that name to this strange deep-sea fish clearly understood exactly what they were looking at. Something that seems to be borrowing pieces from several different animals at once, and somehow making them work together anyway. If you could shine a light down into that darkness right now and watch one drift past, would you even recognize it as a relative of anything you already know? Or would it simply look to your eyes like something that should not exist at all? Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. Have you ever met someone who on paper seems to belong to one particular group, based purely on how they look, or how they dress, or where they grew up, only to discover once you actually got to know them that almost everything important about them belonged somewhere else entirely? That is more or less what happened to our creature's entire scientific reputation for the better part of a century. Because here is the quiet patient case scientists slowly built piece by piece for exactly why our spiral-toothed animal belongs with the ghost sharks of the deep and not with their louder, more famous cousins. Start with the teeth themselves, since that is the one part of this animal anybody has ever actually held in their hands. A true shark's mouth works on a constant, almost disposable replacement system. Rows of teeth, one behind the other, endlessly shed, endlessly regrown a single great white shark, cycling through tens of thousands of teeth across its entire lifetime without a second thought, each one simply falling away the moment it chips or dulls, replaced within days by the row waiting patiently behind it. That system simply does not exist in our creature at all. Its teeth were never shed, never replaced. They simply kept growing, one continuous unbroken structure for the animal's entire life. We will get into exactly how that remarkable process worked a little later, but for now just sit with this one detail. That is not how a shark's mouth operates. It is, however, almost precisely how a chimera's mouth operates, since ghost sharks alive today also carry permanent, continuously growing tooth plates instead of the disposable rows sharks rely on. One matching detail is a coincidence. An entire pattern of matching details quietly building over decades of careful study starts to look a great deal more like an answer. And it is worth mentioning this suspicion did not appear overnight out of nowhere the moment somebody finally cracked the case wide open. It had been building quietly in the background for a surprisingly long time. In 1921, a British paleontologist named Arthur Smith Woodward, a man who had already spent decades examining fossil fish from every corner of the world, proposed an entirely new category for a whole cluster of strange, difficult-to-classify cartilage fish that did not sit comfortably inside the shark family the way everyone had simply assumed. He called this group Radiodonti, a name built from old words meaning something close to slow-toothed, and he suggested cautiously that these animals sat somewhere in between true sharks and the ghost sharks of the deep. Not quite one, not quite the other, occupying their own strange middle ground. It was not a perfect answer. Later researchers would eventually replace his entire framework with a clearer, more accurate picture. But Woodward did not have the full picture available to him yet. Nobody did. What he had was something almost more valuable in the moment, a trained, respected scientist willing to publicly admit that an entire familiar category shark simply stopped fitting the evidence decades before anyone else was willing to say so plainly. Isn't there something quietly satisfying about that? An entire scientific community spends generations arguing about which end of a shark this spiral belonged on tail, fin, jaw, spine, while the far bigger, far stranger question sat there patiently the whole time, almost daring somebody to notice it. This was never really a shark question in the first place. It was a completely different kind of animal wearing a shark's reputation, simply because nobody had yet learned to look past the label. And that mislabeling did more than just confuse a handful of scientists arguing in journals. It quietly shaped an entire century of imagination around this creature's personality, if you can call it that. Sharks in the popular mind mean speed, aggression, relentless, open water pursuit. But the actual living relatives of our spiral-toothed hunter, the ghost sharks drifting through the deep today, are nothing like that at all. They are patient, unhurried. Many of them feed by rooting gently along the seafloor, using soft, sensitive mouths to locate buried prey rather than chasing anything down through open water. If our creature truly belonged with them rather than with the great whites of the world, then perhaps the popular image of a frantic, thrashing sea monster tearing through Permian waters never quite matched who this animal actually was in the first place. Perhaps something closer to a slow, patient, methodical hunter fits the truth far better than a shark ever could. I think there is something worth carrying with you from this part of the story, something that reaches well beyond one strange fossil fish. How often do we sort something, or someone, into a familiar category the moment we spot one recognizable feature, and then simply stop looking any further? A single line on a resume that happens to match a job you already know well, and suddenly you assume you understand the whole person behind it. An accent, a hometown, one detail that fits a story you already have in your head, and the rest gets filled in by assumption rather than by actually paying attention. A sharp tooth, a pointed fin. One striking detail that happens to match something we already know, and suddenly the entire rest of the picture gets quietly filled in by assumption rather than by evidence. Karpinski did this understandably back at his cluttered desk in St. Petersburg. Eastman did it. Obruchev did it. An entire century of very intelligent people did it together, almost without noticing. So here tonight is the actual answer to the question sitting right there in this very story's own title. This was never a true shark at all. It was something rarer, older in its own particular branch and considerably stranger, a distant cousin of the ghostly deep water ratfish still drifting silently through total darkness, somewhere in our oceans at this very moment, most likely completely unaware that one of its ancient spiral-mouthed relatives once terrorized the warm Permian seas above. Somewhere down there tonight, while you're listening to this, one of those quiet, pale-eyed creatures is drifting slowly along the seafloor, carrying in its own strange way a faint echo of a relative it will never know it ever had. And that raises a wonderful new problem all on its own, doesn't it? If our creature's teeth behaved nothing like a shark's teeth, if they never shed, never replaced themselves, simply grew and kept growing for an entire lifetime, then how exactly does a single tooth manage to do that? How do you build an entire mouth, a functioning, effective hunting weapon out of one structure that is never allowed to stop expanding? What happens to all those older, smaller teeth once the newer, larger ones start crowding in beside them? That particular mechanism, the actual biology behind a tooth that refuses to ever fall out, is stranger and more elegant than almost anything else in this whole story. And it is exactly where we are headed next. Let's start with your own face for a moment, because it will actually help explain what we're about to get into. Touch the very center of your chin, right where the bone feels most solid beneath your skin. That seam did not always exist as one single fused piece. When you were an infant, your lower jaw was actually made of two separate halves, meeting right there at the midline, only fusing together into the single bone you carry today sometime in your first year or two of life. Almost every animal with a jaw carries some version of that same seam, that same meeting point where left meets right. Scientists call it the symphysis, a word that simply means growing together, borrowed from an old root, meaning to grow in agreement with something else. For most animals, once that seam closes, it becomes structurally unremarkable, a simple solid joint doing nothing more than holding the two halves of a jaw together for the rest of a lifetime. Look at almost any creature you can think of, and that quiet little seam rarely does anything more interesting than exactly that. Our creature had other plans for that exact same spot. Our creature's most famous, most bizarre feature grew directly out of that exact same seam, right there at the meeting point of the lower jaw instead of a scattering of individual teeth, arranged politely in a row the way you might expect this animal produce something closer to a single continuously unfolding structure. Not many teeth replacing each other one by one. One tooth family, technically speaking, endlessly extending itself, coiling forward on itself again and again as the animal grew larger and older. Nothing else in that jaw worked quite this way. The teeth lining the sides of the mouth behaved more or less like you would expect from any ordinary predator replaced steadily over time. It was only here at this single narrow seam down the middle that the rules seemed to bend entirely. Here is the part that I think deserves a proper pause because it truly upends how most of us instinctively think about teeth. New teeth did not form at the front the way you might picture new growth pushing outward toward the tip of something. They formed at the back close to where the jaw hinges toward the throat, each new tooth slightly larger than the one that came immediately before it scaled up to match the animal's own growing size. It is a strange direction for growth to travel in if you think about it. Most of what we consider growth in the natural world pushes outward and forward roots, spreading branches, reaching antlers, extending toward open space. This animal's growth pushed forward too technically, but only by curling steadily backward on itself first, adding new material at the rear and forcing everything already there to fold gradually inward like a rope being coiled by someone standing perfectly still, feeding the loose end in from behind rather than walking the coil outward. As each new tooth finished forming, it nudged the entire existing chain forward and downward, curling it further and further into that same tightening spiral. The oldest tooth this animal ever grew, the very first smallest one it ever produced as a hatchling, never disappeared. It simply got pushed gently into the very centre of the coil, curling tighter and tighter with every single year the animal continued to live. Have you ever kept something from your childhood tucked away somewhere not because you still use it, but simply because you never got around to throwing it out? A drawing a ticket stub, a small toy that meant nothing to anyone but you. This animal did something remarkably similar with every tooth it ever grew, except it had no choice in the matter at all. There was no drawer to empty, no spring cleaning, no deciding what still deserved to be kept. Because here is the detail that makes this whole structure so different from anything swimming in the ocean today. Nothing ever fell out. A shark, as we have already talked about, sheds and replaces its teeth constantly, an assembly line running for its entire life, each worn tooth simply falling away into the sand below, gone for good, replaced within days by whichever tooth happens to be waiting patiently in line behind it. Our creature's whole dental history simply accumulated instead, one tooth added after another, with nothing ever discarded, nothing ever lost. By the time a fully grown adult was cruising through the Permian seas, its jaw was not just holding its current functional set of teeth. It was quietly carrying every single tooth it had ever grown since the day it was born, curled up together into one continuous spiraling archive. Only the newest, largest, most recently formed teeth sitting right at the outer edge of that coil actually stuck up and did any real biting. The rest, dozens upon dozens of older, smaller teeth, spiraled inward and downward, tucked safely inside a protective channel of cartilage running along the jaw, hidden beneath the gum line, completely out of sight for the rest of the animal's life. Retired in a sense, but never actually thrown away. You could have opened this animal's mouth and looked directly inside, and you still would not have seen most of its own dental history. It was there the entire time, just quietly out of view, coiled beneath the surface like the rings inside a seashell nobody has bothered to crack open. Think about what that means for a moment. Somewhere inside that lower jaw, sealed away where no predator, no prey, nobody at all could ever see it, this animal was quietly storing a complete unbroken timeline of its own life. Every single meal it had ever needed a new tooth for. Every stage of its own growth from its very first days to its final ones permanently preserved, coiled together in order never edited, never erased. I think that is one of the most oddly beautiful details in this entire story. This was an animal that in a very literal sense could not forget where it came from, even if it had somehow wanted to. In the largest whorls scientists have ever recovered, that spiral makes just over 3 complete turns before it finally reaches its centre, a continuous route supporting well over 100 individual teeth. each one slightly different in size from its neighbour, each one marking a distinct chapter in that particular animal's life. If you've ever looked closely at a tree stump, you already understand on some level exactly what paleontologists do with a structure like this. Count the rings, and you can trace a tree's entire life story. The lean years, the good years, sometimes even a scar left behind by fire or drought decades earlier. Biologists studying shellfish rely on almost the exact same trick, counting the fine growth lines layered inside a clam or an oyster shell to work out roughly how many years that animal spent quietly filtering the same patch of seafloor. A whorl like this works in a remarkably similar way. By carefully measuring how the size of each tooth changes as you move outward along the spiral, researchers can reconstruct roughly how quickly a particular animal was growing at different points in its life, and take a reasonable guess at how old it might have been when it finally died. It is a strange thought staying with you for a moment. A tree cannot choose to hide its rings. A clam cannot decide which growth lines to keep private, and neither in the end could this animal. Its entire history was written into its own body, whether it liked it or not, permanently, and in order for anyone patient enough and lucky enough to eventually come along and study it properly. And here's a small, charming coincidence worth mentioning before we move on. Teeth that simply never stop growing are not actually unique to this one ancient creature. Right now, in burrows and hollow logs scattered across the world, ordinary rodents, rats, beavers, squirrels are all quietly relying on the exact same basic trick front teeth that grow continuously, for their entire lives worn down only through constant use, never through natural shedding. Skip that gnawing for even a few weeks, and a beaver's front teeth will keep right on growing anyway, eventually curling painfully out of shape, sometimes even growing back into the animal's own skull. Growth left unchecked does not stop, simply because it has become inconvenient. It is admittedly a happy little accident of naming that this creature's closest living relatives happen to be called ratfish. Two completely unrelated branches of life separated by hundreds of millions of years, both stumbling onto some version of the same peculiar solution, a tooth that simply refuses to stop. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, since we're already deep into the territory of things that never quite let go of their own past. Is there some version of this in your own life? Some old belief, some outdated version of yourself that you never actually discarded, just quietly folded inward and tucked out of sight, still technically part of you, even if nobody looking at you today would ever guess it was still there? An old habit you have long since stopped mentioning out loud. A younger version of yourself, embarrassing in hindsight, that you have not exactly outgrown, so much as simply learned to keep coiled up quietly out of view. There is something worth taking seriously in that comparison, I think, beyond the fun of it. We tend to imagine growth as a process of constant replacement out with the old in, with the new, each new version of ourselves cleanly erasing the one before it. But growth for a great many living things works far more like this animal's jaw than we usually admit. Nothing quite disappears, it simply gets carried forward, curled a little further inward, still there underneath everything newer, whether we choose to look at it or not. There is one more piece of this puzzle worth sitting with before we move on, because it explains how a structure this strange managed to survive the ordinary stress and strain of actually being used to hunt. A loose spiral of 100 or more teeth unsupported would simply not hold together under the stress of biting down on anything at all. So the cartilage forming the sides of the jaw did not just sit there passively. It curved inward gently, bracing the whole coiled structure from either side, cradling it, the way cupped hands might hold something fragile and precious, keeping the whole delicate spiral locked firmly in place, while still allowing the outer newest teeth to do their work. Nothing about this animal's mouth was accidental. Every part of it existed specifically to support a structure that by any ordinary standard should not have been able to function at all. There is a particular kind of respect that comes from noticing that, I think. It is easy to look at something strange in nature and assume it is simply a mistake, a leftover evolution, fumbling its way towards something workable almost by accident. But this jaw was not fumbling toward anything. Every piece of it, the growth at the back, the retention, instead of shedding the cartilage bracing on either side, worked together as a single coordinated solution to a problem. No other animal before or since has ever solved in quite the same way. For the better part of a century, though, all of this remained pure speculation. Every detail I have just described to you, the growth pattern, the retained teeth, the hidden spiral tucked inside the jaw, existed only as an educated guess pieced together slowly, from isolated teeth and careful reasoning, exactly the kind of reasoning we spent an earlier part of tonight's story watching scientist after scientist get wrong in almost every other respect. Think about how strange a position that actually put researchers in. Imagine trying to prove that a coiled structure grew slowly outward over an entire lifetime, tooth by tooth, when every single specimen you have ever held in your own hands is already finished, already fossilized, already frozen at the single moment its owner happened to die. You are not watching growth happen. You're staring at the last frame of a very long film and being asked to describe with confidence everything that came before it. A handful of scattered teeth can suggest a pattern. It cannot prove one. Not on its own. Not without something far more complete to compare it against something that still showed exactly how all those pieces once fit together as a single living structure, rather than a loose scatter of fragments pulled apart by time. What finally turned that guesswork into settled, confirmed fact was not another clever argument or another confident illustration. It was one single, extraordinarily lucky fossil, sitting quietly in the ground of the American West for millions of years, waiting patiently for exactly the right person to stumble across it at exactly the right moment. And that particular discovery, when it finally happens, is unlike anything we have talked about so far tonight. Every good mystery eventually needs a piece of physical evidence, not another clever argument, not another confident sketch, something you can actually hold in your hands that simply refuses to agree with the wrong answer any longer. Our story finally gets one, and it comes from a place you might not expect. Picture the eastern edge of Idaho, close to where it borders Utah, a stretch of quiet, rolling hill country that most people driving through would never think twice about. Underneath those hills sits something remarkable, a thick layer of ancient rock, known to geologists as the Phosphoria Formation, laid down layer upon layer at the bottom of a warm, shallow sea, a little over 270 million years ago. Does that number sound familiar? It should. This is not simply old rock. This is the actual seafloor our spiral-toothed hunter once patrolled, compressed, hardened, and quietly tucked beneath the modern surface of the American West for a length of time that is almost impossible to hold in your head properly. Every layer of that rock settled there one grain at a time, while our creature was still very much alive somewhere above it, hunting through waters that, geologically speaking, no longer exist anywhere on the planet. For most of the 20th century, mining companies have been digging into that same ancient seafloor for an entirely different reason, hunting for phosphate, a mineral essential to fertilizer tucked into those same Permian layers in enormous quantities. Heavy machinery blasting entire hillsides quietly rearranged in the pursuit of something that has absolutely nothing to do with ancient sharks or their strange spiral-toothed relatives. The workers hauling that rock out of the ground are not paleontologists. Most of them are not thinking about the Permian Period at all. They are thinking about tonnage and schedules and getting through another long shift. And yet every so often, alongside the phosphate, that same machinery pulls something else out of the ground entirely. A tooth, a fragment of jaw, occasionally something far stranger. Here's a fact worth sitting with for a moment because I think it says something almost poetic about how discovery actually works. More than half of every Helicoprion fossil ever found on Earth has come out of this one relatively small corner of Idaho. Not Russia, where this whole story began. Not any of the dozen other countries where fragments have occasionally turned up from Australia to Kazakhstan to the icy edges of the Canadian Arctic. Idaho quietly has become the beating heart of everything we know about this animal, largely thanks to an industry that was never once looking for it in the first place. There is something almost humbling in that. The single most important source of knowledge about an ancient sea monster turns out to be a fertilizer mine. In 1950, deep inside a phosphate mine called the Waterloo near a small town called Montpelier, something comes out of the rock that is unlike anything anyone has ever pulled from Idaho ground before. It is at first glance a familiar shape, a coiled disc-shaped whorl of teeth roughly the size of a large dinner plate, 117 individual crowns still clearly countable along its spiral. If this were the whole story, it would already be a fine addition to the growing pile of Helicoprion teeth scattered across museum drawers. By this point, one more entry in a collection that by this point in our story already numbers in the dozens. But this particular piece of rock is not letting go of the whorl alone. Clinging to it, fused in place by more than 200 million years of pressure, is something nobody studying this animal has ever actually had access to before. Cartilage. Fragments of the actual skull and jaw still loosely connected to the tooth whorl itself, exactly where they had been sitting the moment this animal died. Take a second and really sit with what that means, because after everything we have talked about tonight, I think you have earned the payoff. For over half a century, every single scientist involved in this story, Kapinski, Eastman, Simoens, Obruchev, has been forced to reason entirely from isolated teeth disconnected from any surrounding evidence, building an entire animal out of pure inference and careful guesswork. Sketches, comparisons, educated hunches, however well informed. This new specimen is the first one in the whole story that does not require guessing at all. The cartilage is simply there, still attached, still exactly where biology put it, indifferent to a single one of the arguments scientists had been having about it for the past 50 years. For the first time since this whole mystery began, someone is holding physical proof, not an argument, not an illustration, actual proof that at least part of this creature's strange spiral truly belonged inside its own head. It would take, in fact, 16 more years before the wider scientific world properly understands what has just been found. The specimen makes its way eventually into the hands of the one person on Earth best equipped to study it properly. A Danish paleontologist named Sven Erik Bendix Almgren, widely regarded even at the time as the leading authority anywhere in the world on this particular family of ancient fish. If that pattern feels familiar to you, a remarkable fossil pulled out of the ground by people who are not looking for it, eventually finding its way across an ocean to the one scholar capable of understanding it properly it should. This is not the first time this exact thing has happened in tonight's story. It is simply happening again 50 years later, on the opposite side of the world in the opposite direction across the same ocean. History, it turns out, occasionally likes to rhyme with itself, even when nobody involved has any idea it is doing so. By 1966, Bendix Almgren finally publishes his findings. His conclusion lands like a quiet seismic shift underneath decades of confident published guesswork. The whorl, he argues, based on the actual physical cartilage still attached to it, was never on the animal's back. never along its tail, never functioning as some kind of external shock absorber bolted onto the upper jaw. It sat at the very front of an elongated lower jaw tucked into the seam. We spent time understanding earlier tonight the whorl growing and coiling exactly the way we already described. For the very first time, someone is not simply proposing where this structure belonged. Someone is showing you. And yet here is the part of this story I find almost more interesting than the breakthrough itself. Bendix Almgreen, despite holding better evidence than any scientist before him, does not walk away from this specimen feeling triumphant. He walks away from it frustrated. Because as remarkable as this particular fossil is, it did not survive its journey through time undamaged. 270 million years of pressure-shifting rock and geological upheaval had crushed it, twisted sections of it out of their original alignment, disarticulated pieces that once fit together cleanly into a jumble that no longer quite matched itself the way a beautiful piece of furniture might survive a house fire, only to end up warped, split, and impossible to fully restore, no matter how carefully you handle it afterward. Bendix Almgreen can see with total confidence that the whorl belongs in the jaw. What he cannot do, not with this specimen alone, is confidently reconstruct exactly how every single piece of that jaw once fit together in a living, functioning animal. He says as much plainly in his own published work. A truly complete reconstruction, he essentially admits, may simply not be possible from what survived. Isn't that a strange kind of ending for a scientist to sit with? Being the one person who finally gets the biggest, most important piece of the puzzle correct, decisively, undeniably correct, and still not being able to see the whole picture clearly enough to finish the job yourself. There is no triumphant final chapter here, no tidy bow tied around the mystery. Just an honest, careful scientist staring at genuine proof and admitting in print that proof alone was still not quite enough. Here's something worth considering for a moment, because I think it applies well beyond fossils. Have you ever solved the hardest, most important part of a problem, the part everyone else got wrong for years, only to discover that the remaining details still refuse to fall neatly into place? Being right about the big question does not automatically hand you every smaller answer that comes after it. Sometimes the most honest thing a discovery can do is simply narrow the mystery down rather than closing it completely, and sometimes narrowing a mystery down is its own quiet form of victory, even if it does not feel like one at the time. There is a small, almost bittersweet irony sitting quietly underneath this entire chapter, one worth pointing out before we move on. Remember Obruchev from earlier tonight confidently placing this exact structure in the upper jaw as a kind of shock absorber, publishing his careful, reasoned argument in 1952. At that exact moment, the actual physical proof that would have corrected him, cartilage and all, was already sitting inside a rock in an Idaho mining collection, collected 2 years earlier, simply waiting for the right specialist to examine it properly. The answer existed. It was simply not yet in the hands of the person who needed it, sitting in a drawer roughly 6,000 miles from Obruchev's own desk in a country he had no easy way of visiting, in an era when scientific exchange between his part of the world and everywhere else had already grown considerably more difficult. I think that detail says something quietly important about how progress in any field actually works. Being wrong is rarely about being careless. Sometimes it is only ever about timing and access, and which piece of evidence happens to reach which desk first. This same Danish scholar working through Idaho's fossil collections during these years ends up studying more than one remarkable specimen from this region. Another whorl sent to him on loan carries such clear distinctive wear marks along its teeth that he names the species after a Greek phrase meaning roughly the one who has done work. A small, quiet nod to an animal that had clearly spent its whole life actually using the mouth it was born with, biting down on something solid enough, often enough to leave a permanent mark behind. That particular fossil, remarkably, would go on to have its own strange journey. Sent to Denmark for study, it simply vanished from any official listing for more than 60 years, misplaced somewhere in a European collection tucked into storage, and quietly forgotten by nearly everyone who once knew it existed, until a colleague in Copenhagen stumbled across it only very recently and quietly arranged for its long overdue return to Idaho. Even now, more than a century after this story first began in a quarry half a world away, small unexpected pieces of it are apparently still finding their way home. Isn't it strange to think that somewhere out there tonight there may still be other pieces of this same story, sitting quietly in a drawer nobody has thought to open in decades, waiting for someone somewhere to finally notice them again? But the fossil at the centre of tonight's breakthrough, the one carrying that precious cartilage, the one that finally proved the whorl belonged in the mouth after all, does not get its full moment in the spotlight in 1966. Bendix Armgreen's honest, careful, admittedly incomplete study gets filed away, published respected within a small circle of specialists, and then largely forgotten by the wider world. The specimen itself is given a simple, almost bureaucratic name, and quietly placed into storage at a museum in Idaho, one fossil among many others, in a drawer that for the next several decades almost nobody thinks to open again. Careers begin and end. Entire other mysteries rise and get solved elsewhere in paleontology. And through all of it, this particular piece of cartilage and teeth simply sits there, patient correct, and almost completely ignored. It would take a different kind of curiosity entirely decades later to finally pull that particular drawer back open. Not a new fossil, not another expedition. Something far simpler and honestly far more human than that a student who happened to ask one too many questions about one strange half-forgotten jaw at exactly the right moment. And that is exactly where we are headed next. The student we are talking about does not walk into that Idaho museum already chasing a mystery. He walks in on an ordinary campus tour, the kind every new student sits through, in their first few weeks only half paying attention, more interested in finding the nearest coffee machine than in anything sitting behind the display glass. Nobody hands him a case file. Nobody tells him this particular hallway contains the answer to 114 years of scientific disagreement. As far as he knows, he is simply being shown around a building he will spend the next several years of his life in. And then something on one of those shelves stops him completely. A strange coiled whorl of teeth, one among roughly 30 similar specimens, quietly stored in that same collection, more Helicoprion material in one building than exists almost anywhere else on the planet. Most people walking past it would simply glance at the little placard, nod politely, and keep moving toward the next exhibit. This particular student does not keep moving. He recognizes it. Here is where this story takes a turn I find truly delightful, because it is not the kind of detail you usually expect in a tale about scientific discovery. He recognizes the fossil from television, a wildlife documentary special about sharks. The kind that airs once a year to enormous audiences had featured this exact strange, spiral-toothed animal only a few months earlier. Sitting on his couch, half paying attention, the way most of us do with background television, this future scientist had absorbed just enough about this creature to recognize its teeth the instant he saw them in person. He was not studying for an exam. He was not taking notes. He was simply relaxing at the end of a day the way you might be doing right now, and something quietly lodged itself in his memory anyway. Isn't there something worth pausing on there? An entire chain of serious, painstaking scientific work stretching back more than a century to Kapinski's cluttered desk in St. Petersburg to a Danish scholar squinting at crushed cartilage in the 1960s, and the next crucial link in that chain gets forged not in a laboratory, but on a couch in front of a television, because one particular young man happened to be paying just enough attention. His name is Jesse Pruitt, and what he does next matters far more than how he got there in the first place. He starts asking questions. He approaches the collections manager and simply asks what she knows about the whorl sitting in front of him. It is a small, ordinary question, the kind students ask museum staff every single day. But it happens to land on exactly the right person. She remembers that a local artist had recently borrowed a couple of these same specimens for a public exhibit and suggests Pruitt reach out to him directly. That artist's name is Ray Troll, and if you want to understand why this particular part of the story finally breaks the case open, you need to understand him a little first. Troll is not a paleontologist by training. He's a working illustrator, a fine artist with a genuine decades-long obsession with strange ancient fish, the kind of person who draws these creatures not because a university is paying him to, but because something about their impossible anatomy has simply captured his imagination and never quite let go. His studio walls, by every account, are covered in sketches of animals most people have never even heard of, drawn purely out of fascination rather than obligation. He has spent years studying every published illustration of this animal, every competing reconstruction, tracking the whole confused history we've been walking through together tonight, purely out of love for the subject. In a strange way, Troll has been living inside this mystery for years, already long before anyone thought to hand him a proper title for that role. When Pruitt reaches out, Troll does not hesitate. He tells him exactly where to look. Find Bendix Arm Green's old paper, Troll says, and once you have it, go find the specific fossil he was describing sitting right there in your own museum's collection. It has a name, Idaho number 4. Think about that phrase for a moment, because we already know exactly what it means. This is the very same specimen we spent an earlier part of tonight's story following, the one pulled from a phosphate mine in 1950, the one carrying that precious irreplaceable cartilage, the one a careful, honest Danish scientist studied for years before admitting in print that he could not quite finish the job. It has been sitting in that collection the entire time, correctly identified, properly catalogued, and almost completely unexamined by anyone new for the better part of half a century. Pruitt brings what he has learned to his academic advisor, a paleontologist named Leif Tapanila. And here is a small, honest detail I appreciate about this part of the story. Tapanila, an expert in exactly this field, working at an institution holding the largest public collection of this animal's fossils anywhere on Earth, had not actually gone through Bendix Arm Green's original paper himself until his own student brought it to his attention. There's no shame in that, and Tapanila, to his credit, never treats it as one. A specialist's career is not built on having personally gone through every paper ever written in their own field. It is built on knowing where to look, and on being willing to look again when someone hands them a good enough reason. Even the specialists, it turns out, do not automatically know everything sitting in their own backyard. Sometimes it simply takes someone new walking in without decades of assumptions already built up, to ask the question everyone else stopped asking a long time ago. Have you ever worked somewhere or lived somewhere for years only to have a visitor point out something remarkable sitting right in front of you the entire time, something you had simply stopped noticing? It happens more often than any of us would like to admit. Familiarity has a strange way of making things invisible, not because they stop mattering, but simply because we stop actively looking at them. Tapanila gets curious, properly curious, and once he does, the three of them, a student, an artist, and a professor, arrive at the same conclusion together. This particular fossil deserves a second look using tools nobody had access to back in 1966. That tool is a scanner originally built for an entirely different purpose altogether. a hospital-grade machine, the same basic technology doctors use to look inside a living human body without ever needing to cut it open, repurposed here to look inside 270-million-year-old stone. Slice by slice, the machine builds up an image from the inside out layer after layer, eventually assembling a complete three-dimensional picture of everything hidden beneath the surface, all without a single scientist ever needing to risk damaging the actual fossil by prying it apart with their own two hands. Somewhere a hospital radiology department is scanning a patient's shoulder or a fractured wrist using the exact same underlying principle a team of paleontologists is about to use to peer inside the mouth of a Permian sea monster. Science, it turns out, borrows tools across disciplines far more often than most of us ever stop to notice. This matters enormously if you think back to Bendix Armgreen's own frustration. His entire problem decades earlier was that the specimen in front of him was too fragile, too crushed, too disarticulated to physically separate and study piece by piece without risking permanent damage to something irreplaceable. A scan solves that problem entirely. You do not need to touch the puzzle at all. You simply need a machine patient enough and precise enough to see straight through the stone surrounding it. In 2013, the team finally publishes their results in a respected scientific journal, connected to one of the oldest scientific institutions in the world, alongside a small group of collaborators from several different universities, each one contributing a different piece of expertise to the final picture. Paleontologists, anatomists, specialists in exactly how modern cartilaginous fish move their jaws when they bite down on something. It is worth remembering tonight that breakthroughs like this one are rarely the work of a single brilliant mind working alone in a room. More often they look exactly like this. Several different people, several different specialties quietly compared and combined until the full picture finally clicks into place. And what that scan reveals settles once and for all a debate that has been running in one form or another for well over 100 years. The whorl was not a small tucked-away structure hidden at the very front of the jaw, the way even Bendix Armgreen himself had cautiously proposed. It ran along the entire length of the lower jaw from front to back, a single continuous spiral occupying nearly the whole structure, supported the entire way by cartilage on either side. Every single piece Bendix Armgreen had correctly identified the placement in the mouth. The growth pattern we already walked through earlier tonight turns out to have been right all along. What his eyes simply could not see, trapped inside crushed, disarticulated stone, the scanner finally revealed in complete three-dimensional clarity. I love that detail more than almost anything else in this entire story. This was not a case of an old scientist being proven wrong by a newer one. It was a case of an old scientist being proven right fully, completely, decades after he had passed the mystery along, simply because somebody younger finally had the right tool to finish showing what he had already correctly guessed. Pruitt himself later describes that particular fossil as something close to a key finally capable of unlocking the entire animal, a single specimen complete enough to make sense of every fragment scientists had been collecting and arguing over for well over a century. One fossil sitting quietly in a drawer the entire time waiting for exactly the right combination of curiosity and technology to finally make sense of it properly. It is a strange kind of honour for a piece of stone to carry, being the one object responsible for finally settling an argument that outlasted the man who first found it, the man who first properly studied it, and very nearly outlasted the institution storing it as well. Here's something worth sitting with before we move any further tonight. The breakthrough that finally solved this mystery did not require a single new fossil pulled out of the ground. Every piece of physical evidence needed to answer this question had already been sitting in that museum for decades, correctly labelled, properly stored, patiently waiting. What was actually missing was not evidence. It was attention. A fresh set of eyes, a slightly different question, and a tool built for an entirely unrelated purpose, borrowed and repurposed at exactly the right moment. Sometimes the hardest part of solving a problem has nothing to do with finding new information at all. Sometimes it is simply about being willing to look properly at what was already right there in front of everyone. How many answers do you think are quietly sitting around us right now, not because nobody has ever found them, but simply because nobody has yet thought to look at them properly? A question you have been asking yourself for years that already has more information available to answer it than you have ever actually sat down and gathered together. A skill you already half possess scattered across old notes and half-finished attempts simply waiting for someone, maybe even you, to finally put the pieces in the right order. So after well over a century of guessing wrong of spines and tails and shock-absorbing upper jaws, we finally know with real demonstrable certainty exactly where this animal's strangest feature actually belonged, and roughly how it grew there across an entire lifetime. Karpinski's original question, the one that sent an entire branch of science chasing shadows for generation after generation, finally has an answer that everyone involved, artist, student and professor alike, can point to with total confidence. But knowing where something sits and understanding how it actually worked while the animal was alive and hunting turn out to be two very different questions entirely. Knowing exactly where a weapon sits inside a mouth is one thing. Understanding how that weapon actually fired is something else entirely. A locksmith can tell you exactly where every pin sits inside a lock, without ever being able to tell you how smoothly the whole mechanism actually turns. That is precisely the next question the research team sets out to answer, once the CT scans finally reveal the true shape of this animal's jaw. Because now that scientists finally have a complete three-dimensional map of every piece of cartilage involved, they are able to do something nobody could ever attempt with scattered, disconnected teeth alone. They can build a working model, not just a picture of the jaw sitting still, but a simulation of the jaw actually moving, opening, closing and biting down the way it would have while this animal was still alive and hunting. Engineers use this exact same basic approach to test how a new machine part will behave under stress long before anyone builds the physical version. Here the machine part in question simply happens to be 270 million years old, and what that model reveals turns out to be stranger and considerably more elegant than almost anyone had guessed. Picture for a moment how your own jaw works. It hinges open, drops down, and closes back up in a fairly simple, straightforward motion, teeth meeting teeth in more or less a straight line. That is how the overwhelming majority of jawed animals on this planet have always eaten, from the smallest minnow to the largest whale. Our creature's lower jaw did not work that way at all. As the jaw closed, it did not simply swing shut. It rotated. The whole lower jaw rolled backward and downward as it came up to meet the upper jaw, and because the tooth whorl was mounted directly onto that rotating structure, the entire spiral of teeth rolled along with it, turning in place the way a wheel turns on its axle. The newest, largest teeth sitting at the very front edge of the coil would have been the first to make contact with anything caught in the mouth, and then as the jaw kept rotating through its closing motion, those same teeth would drag whatever they had caught backward and downward, deeper into the mouth, exactly the way a conveyor belt carries a package steadily toward the back of a warehouse, never pausing, never reversing direction, simply feeding everything it catches inexorably deeper. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, because I think it changes how you picture this animal completely. Have you ever imagined a bite as a single sudden event, jaws snapping shut, and that is the whole story? Because this was not that. This was closer to a continuous rolling motion teeth, actively pulling and processing prey with every single degree the jaw rotated through, not just clamping down once and holding on. A normal predator bites, and the moment is over almost as quickly as it began. This animal's bite was closer to a process than an instant something that unfolded piece by piece over the full length of a single closing motion. Different sections of that spiral, it turns out, were not doing identical jobs either. The newest teeth toward the front, larger, sharper, freshly grown, worked mainly to hook and drag, snagging hold of prey the instant the jaw began to close, functioning almost like a row of curved fingers reaching out to grab hold of anything nearby. Moving further back along the coil, smaller, more tightly packed teeth took over the work of piercing and slicing, cutting into whatever had just been dragged toward them. And further back still, the oldest, most deeply curled teeth near the center of the spiral helped push everything the rest of the mouth had already processed further along, deeper into the throat, ready to be swallowed. One single structure, 3 distinct jobs working in sequence, the way different stations along an assembly line, each handle their own small part of a larger process, before passing the work along to the next hook, then cut, then swallow over and over with every single rotation of the jaw. I find something almost beautiful in that design, if I'm honest with you. This was not a blunt weapon. It was closer to a piece of specialized machinery purpose, built for a very particular kind of task, every section of it doing exactly one job and doing it well. Now here's where the story gets even more interesting, because researchers did not stop at simply describing the motion. They wanted to know how much force this jaw could actually generate, and what that force tells us about what this animal was truly built to eat. Muscle itself does not fossilize, of course. Soft tissue vanishes long before cartilage ever gets the chance to turn to stone. But the shape of the cartilage that remains still carries clues about the muscle that once wrapped around it, the way an empty glove still hints at the shape of the hand that used to fill it. Careful biomechanical modeling reconstructing the muscles that would have powered this jaw based on its overall shape and size produced estimates landing somewhere between roughly 270 pounds of force and as much as 540 pounds concentrated at a single biting point. To put that in perspective, imagine the entire weight of 2 grown adults pressing down together onto one single narrow point. That is comfortably within the range of some of the more powerful bites recorded among living animals today. More than enough force on paper to crush through something solid. And yet, and this is the part that truly surprised researchers, all that raw power turns out to have been the wrong question to focus on. Because here is what the shape of that spiral actually does to anything caught inside it. If you imagine trying to bite down on something hard and rigid, an armored shelled creature for instance, the curved geometry of that rotating whorl works against you. As the jaw rotates through its closing motion, anything stiff and unyielding tends to simply slip forward, sliding right back out along the same curve that was supposed to be trapping it, the same way a hard round object rolls right out of a tightly curled hand no matter how firmly you try to grip it. The upper jaw, for its part, offered no real gripping surface, either nothing sharp enough to hold a hard-shelled creature in place, while the lower jaw did its work. A perfectly rigid shell, in other words, simply defeats the whole mechanism, sliding away exactly when the animal needed it to stay put. Soft-bodied prey, though, behaves in an entirely different way. Something soft does not slip. It deforms, it folds, compresses, and gets caught in the gap between the upper jaw and the rotating whorl, held firmly in place precisely because it does not resist the shape closing around it. Squeeze a rubber ball and a marble in the exact same grip and only one of them stays trapped. In other words, this entire elaborate mouth, the coiling growth, the rotating bite, the assembly line of teeth appears to have been built almost specifically around prey that gives, rather than prey that fights back with its own hard shell? That answers a question scientists had actually been debating for years before this particular study. Earlier researchers had wondered whether this animal specialized in hunting ammonoids, those coiled, hard-shelled relatives of squid so common throughout Permian seas, using the whorl almost like a can opener to crack them apart. The biomechanical modelling suggests something quite different. Squid, or their softer, shell-less cousins, creatures with nothing but muscle and flesh for this remarkable mouth to work with. There is a small, almost forensic detail supporting this picture too, the kind of evidence that feels closer to a crime scene than a dinner plate. Under close microscopic study, some of these teeth carry faint scratch marks along their surface. Fine lines consistent with soft material being pressed and dragged directly against the opposing jaw during feeding, rather than the chips and fractures you would expect from grinding against something hard and unyielding. The mouth itself, in other words, left behind a quiet trace of exactly what it had been eating written directly onto the surface of its own teeth. And here is a detail I particularly love because it borrows evidence from a place you would probably never expect. To understand how an animal like this might have hunted, researchers look toward an entirely different branch of the animal kingdom, altogether modern toothed whales. Sperm whales in particular dive deep into darkness to hunt giant squid using teeth that barely chew, at all simple conical structures used mainly for gripping rather than slicing, because soft-bodied prey simply does not require the kind of crushing teeth built for something with a shell or a skeleton. A sperm whale does not need to butcher its meal. It needs to catch it, hold onto it, and swallow it mostly whole. If a massive modern predator specializing in exactly this kind of prey gets by perfectly well with teeth built for grabbing rather than grinding, then perhaps our own ancient hunter was working from a strikingly similar playbook, separated by hundreds of millions of years and an entirely different branch of the tree of life. Isn't it strange and honestly kind of wonderful that two animals this distantly related, one a warm-blooded mammal breathing air at the surface, one a cold-blooded relative of ancient cartilage fish that never once left the water, could independently arrive at roughly the same solution simply because they were both chasing the same kind of meal? I think there is something worth carrying with you from this part of the story too. We tend to assume the most impressive weapon is always the one built for raw destruction, maximum force, maximum damage. But this jaw suggests something more thoughtful than that. Real effectiveness in nature, and honestly in most other places, too often has less to do with how hard you can hit something, and more to do with how precisely your tools are matched to the actual problem in front of you. A hammer is not a better tool than a scalpel, it simply solves a different problem. The animals that tend to last in evolutionary terms are rarely the ones swinging the biggest hammer at everything they encounter. They are the ones that figured out with remarkable precision exactly which problem they were actually built to solve, and then committed to solving that one problem extraordinarily well. So here finally, after well over a century of guessing, is a genuine evidence-backed picture of this animal, doing the one thing every single fossil hunter, illustrator, and scientist in this story has ultimately been trying to understand. Not just what it looked like, not just where its strangest feature sat, but what it actually did with that feature, hunting quietly through warm Permian water, rolling that spiral of teeth through soft unlucky prey with a kind of mechanical precision that took modern science more than 100 years to properly appreciate. Somewhere in a warm current, a squid, or one of its softer relatives, drifts too close, feels the water shift and never quite understands what has just closed around it, which raises one more question worth asking before we move any further into tonight's story. A mouth this specialized, this precisely tuned to one particular kind of prey, Built inside an animal patient enough to grow slowly across an entire lifetime, one tooth at a time tends to belong to something correspondingly large, and that it turns out is very much the case here. Just how big did this animal actually get, and what did that size cost it? Living inside an ocean it did not entirely control, size in the natural world is rarely just a number. It is a decision an animal's entire body has already made about how it plans to survive, what it plans to eat, and how much it can afford to fear. And this particular animal made a fairly bold one. Let's start with what actually survives in the fossil collections scientists have gathered so far, because the numbers alone are worth sitting with for a moment. A typical fully grown individual likely measured somewhere around 10 to 13 feet, from nose to tail, already a formidable size by almost any standard. You could reasonably compare it to roughly the length of a small fishing boat. But the largest specimens recovered so far, the true giants of the species, appear to have stretched considerably further than that, potentially reaching lengths approaching 25 feet. One single jaw fragment recovered from that same fossil-rich stretch of Idaho we spent time in earlier tonight measures roughly 2 feet across, on its own believed to be the largest piece of this particular animal ever pulled from the ground. Try to picture that for a second. Not the whole animal, just one fragment of its jaw wider than most kitchen countertops. For a point of comparison that might land a little closer to home, a fully grown great white shark today, one of the true celebrities of the modern ocean, typically measures somewhere between 11 and 16 feet, with only the rare exceptional individual ever confirmed to approach 20 feet. Our creature at its largest was not simply competing with that modern predator. In terms of raw length, it may well have surpassed it, and did so roughly 270 million years before a great white shark ever existed to be compared against at all. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. When you picture an apex predator, the undisputed top of an entire food chain, what usually comes to mind first? For most of us, it is probably something living today, a great white orca, maybe a crocodile lurking near a riverbank. It is easy to forget that the title of apex predator has changed hands many, many times across the long history of life on this planet, passed from one lineage to another, as oceans rose and fell, as continents drifted apart and slammed back together, as entire branches of the animal kingdom rose to dominance and eventually faded again. For a stretch of the Permian period, that title belonged to something with a spiral of teeth instead of a normal mouth. To really understand what that title meant, we need to picture the neighborhood this animal was actually the top of. We've already talked about the ocean itself, the single vast body of water wrapped around a single unbroken supercontinent, warm along its shallow edges, black and freezing in its depths. But an ocean is never just water. It is a crowded, competitive, endlessly hungry neighborhood, and the Permian version of that neighborhood was busier than you might expect. Down along the seafloor, entire reef systems had built themselves out of creatures you've probably never heard of, distant relatives of clams called brachiopods, clustered together by the thousands across shallow banks and delicate stalked filter feeders called crinoids, swaying gently in the current like an underwater field of flowers, quietly filtering food out of passing water, one tiny particle at a time. These reefs were not quiet, empty places. They were some of the most densely populated real estate anywhere in that ancient ocean, an entire underwater city built slowly, one tiny calcium skeleton at a time over millions upon millions of years. Above them the water was thick with coiled-shelled cephalopods, ammonoids and nautiloids, close relatives of today's squid and octopus tucked safely inside, spiraled shells for protection, drifting through open water in numbers that would have made an easy, reliable meal for almost anything patient enough to hunt them properly. Other cartilage fish patrolled in same waters too, some closely related to our creature, some only distant cousins, each one carving out its own particular niche in a food web that had been quietly assembling itself for tens of millions of years before this animal ever existed at all. And sitting at the very top of that entire crowded arrangement, with essentially nothing left alive in that ocean capable of seriously threatening a fully grown adult, was our spiral-toothed hunter. Being an apex predator does not simply mean being the biggest or the strongest, though this animal was certainly both of those things by any reasonable Permian standard. It means occupying a very particular, very privileged position inside an entire ecosystem, a position that comes with real consequences for every other creature sharing that same water. Remove an apex predator and prey, populations can quietly explode, throwing an entire food web out of balance in ways that ripple outward for generations, the same pattern ecologists have documented in modern oceans whenever a top predator gets removed from a reef system too quickly. Keep one in place, and the whole system tends to stay in a kind of rough, constantly adjusting equilibrium. For as long as our creature patrolled those waters, it was not simply eating. It was in its own quiet way helping hold an entire underwater world together. You can actually see a version of this exact same pattern playing out in today's oceans if you know where to look. The largest animals alive on Earth right now, blue whales stretching close to 100 feet, are not generalist hunters chasing whatever happens to swim past. They are extreme specialists, entire bodies built around filtering enormous quantities of some of the smallest creatures in the ocean, tiny shrimp-like animals called krill gathered by the ton with every single feeding pass. Massive size and narrow specialization again and again throughout the history of life on this planet seem to travel together, each one quietly reinforcing the other. Isn't there something worth pausing on there? An animal never sets out to become an apex predator. It simply keeps surviving, keeps eating, keeps outcompeting. Whatever else was trying to occupy the exact same space until one day, without ever announcing it, it finds itself sitting at the very top with nothing above it anymore. Now here is a question worth asking honestly, because I think it deserves more than a simple answer. Why does any animal evolve toward genuine gigantism in the first place? Growing this large is not free. It comes with real, unavoidable costs, and nature rarely hands out size without demanding something significant in return. A larger body needs considerably more food to sustain itself day after day, year after year, with no real option to simply eat less when a particular season runs lean. There is no pausing metabolism, no taking a week off from needing calories simply because the local hunting has gotten difficult. Growth itself slows down as an animal gets larger, meaning it likely took years, possibly many years, for our creature to reach anything close to its full adult size, exactly the kind of patient gradual growth pattern we already saw, written directly into the rings of its own spiraling teeth earlier tonight. Reproduction tends to slow as well in larger, longer-lived animals. Fewer offspring produced less frequently, each one representing a larger biological investment than a smaller, faster breeding creature would ever need to make. A smaller, quicker breeding species can recover from a bad year relatively fast. A slow-growing giant cannot. So why take on all of that cost and risk at all? Because for a very long stretch of time the benefits clearly outweighed them. A larger body meant fewer natural threats, since almost nothing else in that ocean was physically capable of successfully attacking a fully grown adult. It likely meant the ability to range further hunting across a wider stretch of ocean in search of the specific soft-bodied prey. Its remarkable mouth was so precisely built to catch following seasonal migrations of squid and their relatives, the way a modern whale follows shifting currents of food across an entire ocean basin. And it meant an animal that once it survived its vulnerable early years, The years when a young, still growing individual would have been especially at risk from other predators could reasonably expect to keep growing, keep eating, and keep holding its position at the top of that food web for a very long time indeed. Gigantism and specialization, in other words, tend to arrive together, and for good reason. An animal that has already built an extraordinarily precise, extraordinarily effective tool for gathering one particular kind of food has every incentive to grow as large as that food supply can comfortably support, because size in a stable cooperative ecosystem is rarely a liability. It is a reward. The bigger you get, the fewer things can hurt you, and the more of that specialized food supply you can afford to claim for yourself before anything else even gets close to it. It is a strategy that rewards patience, commitment, and a stable, predictable world willing to keep supplying exactly the same kind of meal year after year for as long as the animal needs it to. I think there is something worth carrying forward from this part of the story, something we will need again before tonight is finished. Every advantage this animal built for itself, its size, its extraordinary specialized mouth, its position at the very top of an entire ocean, was built specifically around the world exactly as it existed at that particular moment. Nothing about evolution plans ahead for a world that might change. It simply optimizes relentlessly for the world sitting directly in front of it right now today, with no regard whatsoever for how long that particular version of the world is actually going to last. Have you ever built your entire life, your career, your sense of who you are around conditions that felt permanent at the time, only to watch later how fragile that foundation actually turned out to be once something around you shifted? A job that seemed secure for as long as you could imagine, a skill that seemed guaranteed to matter forever, a version of the world you simply assumed would still be there more or less unchanged whenever you finally needed it again. I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I'm saying it because I think this particular animal's story is about to make that exact point more vividly than almost anything else we have talked about tonight. For now, though, let's simply sit with this picture a little longer because it deserves to be appreciated on its own terms before we move forward. A creature roughly the length of a two-car garage patrolling a warm ancient sea with total uncontested confidence, its spiral mouth rolling steadily through prey after prey, its position at the top of an entire underwater world, feeling from the inside permanent, unshakable, and completely secure. Somewhere beneath it, reefs continue building themselves one small skeleton at a time. Somewhere above it, the surface catches sunlight the way it has for longer than this animal's entire lineage has existed. Nothing from where this creature is sitting suggests that any of this is temporary. It was not going to stay that way forever. Very little in the history of this planet ever does. Empires end, ecosystems shift, even oceans eventually stop looking anything like the ones that built them. And the story of exactly what finally changed what actually happened to an ocean. This animal had every reason to believe it would always control is where we are headed next. If you already know a little something about this particular stretch of Earth's history, you're probably expecting a very specific ending right about now. The famous one. The catastrophe. Most documentaries reach for whenever the word Permian comes up at all. And we will absolutely get there tonight because it deserves its place in this story on its own terms, regardless of what it does or does not turn out to mean for our particular creature. But the actual answer to what happened to our creature turns out to be quieter, stranger, and considerably more thought-provoking than the ending you are probably bracing yourself for. Let's start with a catastrophe everyone already half expects because it earns every bit of its fearsome reputation. Somewhere around 252 million years ago, toward the very end of the Permian Period, something happens deep beneath what is now Siberia that will go on to reshape the entire history of life on this planet. A colossal series of volcanic eruptions stretching on not for days or weeks, but for many thousands of years begins pouring molten rock and gas out of the Earth's crust, across an area so vast it is difficult to picture properly an eruption, on a scale that has no real modern equivalent to compare it against. If you tried to walk across the full extent of the rock, those eruptions eventually left behind, you would still be walking day after day, long after you'd grown tired of counting how far you had come. Carbon dioxide floods into the atmosphere in quantities the planet has rarely experienced before or since. Global temperatures climb. Rain turns acidic, falling from the sky, already hostile to nearly everything it touches. And in the oceans, the consequences turn out to be even more severe than on land. As that carbon dioxide dissolves into seawater, the ocean itself begins turning against nearly everything living inside it. Acidity rises slowly, dissolving the very shells and skeletons so many creatures had spent their entire evolutionary history learning to build. Oxygen levels collapse in some regions, dropping close to nothing at all, entire stretches of seafloor turning into lifeless, suffocating dead zones, silent in a way that ocean floor had not been silent for hundreds of millions of years. When scientists finally add up the damage centuries later, painstakingly comparing fossil layers from before and after this event across the entire planet, the number that comes back is almost impossible to hold in your head properly. Something close to 96% of all marine species alive at that moment simply disappear. Not 96% of individual creatures, 96% of entire species, whole branches of the evolutionary tree snapped off permanently, all at once. It remains to this day the single worst extinction event this planet has ever experienced, so severe that scientists studying it eventually gave it a name that does not bother softening the blow at all. The Great Dying. Here's a question worth sitting with for a moment, and I promise there is a reason I am asking it. If you had to guess right now where our spiral-toothed hunter fits into that story, what would you assume swimming through those final catastrophic years, one of countless casualties caught in the worst environmental collapse the ocean has ever endured? That is certainly the assumption most people would reasonably make. Even a fair number of documentaries and articles casually written about this animal repeat that same assumption without ever double-checking it carefully. And based on the best evidence currently available, it appears to be wrong. When researchers carefully map out exactly when Helicoprion fossils actually stop appearing in the layers of rock, the timeline does not line up neatly with the Great Dying at all. The youngest confirmed fossils belong to rock layers laid down roughly midway through the Permian Period, tens of millions of years before those Siberian volcanoes ever begin erupting. By the time the ocean itself was collapsing around nearly everything else, our particular animal, as far as the fossils currently show us already, appears to have been gone. I find that detail almost more unsettling than the mass extinction itself, if I am honest with you. Not a dramatic final chapter choking alongside countless other species in a single, catastrophic collapse. Something quieter. An animal that seems to have simply faded out of the fossil layers on its own, years before the world it had once ruled ever officially ended. So what actually happened? Here is where we come back to something we spent real time sitting with just a little while ago tonight, because I think it finally pays off properly right here. Remember the conversation about size and specialization, and how tightly those two things tend to travel together. A body this large, needing this much food built around one specific narrow category of prey, is a strategy that performs beautifully during good stable years. It is considerably less forgiving the moment conditions start to shift, even gradually, even quietly, long before any single dramatic catastrophe ever arrives to finish the job. Several researchers studying this exact question have proposed something scientists sometimes call background extinction, a slower, less dramatic kind of ending than the sudden headline-grabbing catastrophes we usually picture when we think about a species disappearing forever. Rather than one single violent event wiping a species out all at once, background extinction happens gradually as shifting sea levels, changing ocean currents, or a slowly declining prey population squeeze a highly specialized animal a little tighter, each passing generation, until eventually there simply are not enough of the right resources left to sustain a population of giants that size. No single dramatic event, just a slow tightening of the exact conditions this animal had built its entire existence around generation after generation, until the margins that once supported an apex predator simply were not wide enough anymore. Think about what that would have actually looked like in practice rather than as an abstract idea. Not a single bad year, a slow drift, perhaps a shift in ocean currents nudging the squid and soft-bodied cephalopods this animal depended on towards slightly different waters, slightly deeper, slightly further away, generation after generation. Each individual year might have looked to any observer more or less like the year before it. It is only when you step back far enough the way paleontologists eventually did that the slow, unmistakable decline becomes visible at all. Have you ever watched something fail not because of one obvious disaster, but because of a long, slow accumulation of smaller pressures, each one manageable on its own, that eventually added up to more than the system could bear? That is roughly the picture researchers have pieced together here. The very same traits that made this animal so dominant, its size, its narrow, precisely tuned diet, its patient, slow-growing life cycle, appear to have left it with remarkably little room to adjust once its particular corner of the ocean began quietly to change underneath it. I think this is worth sitting with a little longer because it complicates the story in a way I actually find more honest than a simple dramatic ending would have been. We tend to love extinction stories with a single clear villain, a comet, an eruption, a single unmistakable moment where everything changes at once. This story does not offer you that. It offers you something closer to how most endings in nature and honestly in life generally actually tend to unfold, slowly, quietly, the world shifting just enough in just the wrong direction, for just long enough that an animal built entirely for the world as it used to be simply runs out of room to keep existing in the world as it has become. And here is the detail that to me makes this whole picture even more striking. Our creature's broader family did not disappear alongside it. Several of its more modestly sized, less rigidly specialized cousins continued on for millions of years after Helicoprion itself had already vanished, some persisting all the way through the great dying itself and into the following period, beyond it quietly surviving the exact catastrophe that our own spiral-toothed hunter never had to face. Being part of the same family carrying the same strange spiral-toothed heritage was clearly not what determined who survived and who did not. What mattered, it seems, was how tightly each particular branch of that family had committed itself to one specific, unforgiving way of living. A smaller relative willing to eat a wider range of prey without the enormous caloric demands of a body stretching 25 feet simply had more room to bend when conditions shifted. Our creature, having committed so completely to being the very best at one specific narrow way of surviving, had considerably less room to bend at all. Isn't there something worth carrying forward from that beyond the fossils entirely? Specialization is not on its own a mistake. It can be extraordinarily effective exactly the way we saw, with this animal's whole remarkable career sitting at the very top of an entire ocean for millions of years, unmatched, uncontested, apparently untouchable. But the more precisely something is built for one particular version of the world, the more that same precision can become a liability the moment the world quietly stops holding up its end of the arrangement. There is a real, honest tension there, one that does not resolve into a simple lesson about always staying flexible no matter what. Specializing is often exactly how you win for a while. It is simply worth remembering that winning for a while and winning forever tend to require different things entirely. By the time those Siberian volcanoes finally do erupt, reshaping the entire planet, poisoning oceans driving the single greatest wave of extinction this world has ever recorded, our spiral-toothed hunter is not there to experience any of it. The ocean, it once ruled the reefs. The drifting clouds of ammonoids, nearly all of it, gets swept away in that same catastrophe. An entire world dismantled within what is, geologically speaking, barely more than a passing moment. Everything we spent time picturing together earlier tonight, the crinoids swaying like an underwater field of flowers, the reef systems built one tiny skeleton at a time, most of it simply stops existing within a shockingly narrow window of geological time. But the animal whose strange coiled mouth opened this entire story tonight had already quietly, guardedly left the stage before the final curtain ever came down. There is something both sad and strangely gentle in that if you sit with it long enough. No dramatic final battle, no last desperate struggle against a collapsing world. Simply a slow quiet fading sometime in the middle of the Permian, leaving behind nothing but a scattering of strange spiral teeth for something to eventually stumble across more than 250 million years later in a stretch of hills on the other side of the world. In a strange way, I find that easier to sit with than the alternative. There is a kind of mercy in an ending that happens quietly off stage long before the worst of it ever actually arrives. But an ending like that raises one more question worth asking before we bring tonight's story to a close. If this animal really did disappear quietly decades and eons before the rest of its world caught up to the same fate, what if anything actually remains of it today? And why of everything that has ever swum through this planet's oceans, has this particular strange creature managed to hold our attention for more than a century after its own extinction? A creature that vanished from the ocean millions of years before the world's worst catastrophe ever arrived, should by most reasonable logic have faded quietly out of memory too. Most species that lived and died across the Permian never get a name at all, let alone a story told to strangers more than 250 million years later in the dark, right before they fall asleep. Entire branches of ancient life have come and gone without leaving so much as a footnote behind them. So why did this particular animal get to be the exception? Let's start with a place that more than anywhere else on Earth kept this mystery alive long enough for someone to finally solve it. We have already spent real time in Idaho tonight inside that same quiet stretch of phosphate-rich hills, but it is worth returning there one final time because the story has not actually stopped unfolding since we last left it. More than half of every confirmed Helicoprion specimen on the planet has come out of that single American state, and the museum holding most of them continues to receive new material to this day. Fresh fragments still occasionally surfacing from the same mining operations that started pulling teeth out of the ground generations ago. This is not a closed case sitting quietly in an archive somewhere. It is an active, ongoing area of research with new questions still being asked about a creature people once assumed had already given up every secret it had. Every so often, somewhere in that same stretch of hills, a piece of machinery pulls up another fragment, and the entire careful process of comparing, measuring, and questioning starts all over again. Even the family tree around this animal keeps quietly rearranging itself. In recent years, paleontologists studying related specimens have proposed entirely new genera close cousins that once sat lumped together under older, less precise names, now being carefully separated out and given identities of their own, as researchers apply increasingly careful comparisons to specimens gathered from Russia, from the United States, and from collections scattered across the world. One newly recognized genus described only in the past few years was built specifically to house material that had spent nearly a century mistakenly filed under a name that never quite fit it properly. Another relative first grouped alongside our creature under a shared older classification has since been carefully separated out entirely, given its own name, its own identity. Once scientists finally had the tools and the patience to notice exactly where the two animals actually differed, imagine spending 100 years mistaken for your cousin simply because nobody had bothered to look closely enough to notice the difference. That is essentially what happened to more than one of these ancient spiral-toothed relatives, quietly waiting their turn to finally be seen clearly. Science, in other words, is still actively working through the same basic problem Karpinski first ran into back in his cluttered office in St. Petersburg. How do you correctly sort something this strange into categories built for animals that behave nothing like it? And the geography keeps expanding too. Beyond Russia, beyond Idaho, beyond the handful of countries we have already mentioned tonight, researchers working in parts of China have continued to turn up fragments of this same extended family. In recent years, tucked inside rock formations, most people outside the field have never heard of evidence that this animal's range stretched across nearly the entire breadth of that single ancient ocean, from one edge of the vanished supercontinent to the other. A creature that spent its entire life confined to one ancient vanished ocean continues roughly 270 million years after it first swam through that water, to surface in new corners of the modern world almost every few years, as if it still has a few more surprises left to offer anyone patient enough to keep looking. Every new fragment adds one more data point to a picture that remarkably is still being filled in piece by piece, more than a century after the very first piece was ever pulled out of the ground. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment, because I think it says something honest about how science actually works, long after the exciting breakthrough moment has already happened, and the cameras, metaphorically speaking, have already moved on to the next story. The CT scan we talked about earlier tonight did not close this case completely. It simply raised the quality of every question that came after it. That is usually how real progress works. Not a single door swinging open to reveal the entire truth all at once, but one door leading quietly to the next one and then the next, for as long as anyone remains curious enough to keep opening them. We like to imagine discovery as a finish line, a single moment where the mystery officially ends and everyone goes home satisfied. In practice, it looks a lot more like this: an ever-lengthening hallway, each door slightly harder to find than the last, but each one, if you're patient enough, still very much there to be opened. So why has this particular animal managed to hold so many people's attention for so long, when countless other extinct creatures, equally strange in their own way, simply faded into obscurity without anyone noticing at all? I think part of the answer is simply how the mystery was shaped. This was never a story about finding something. It was a story about understanding something everyone already had in their hands the entire time. A tooth. A single strange spiral-shaped tooth sitting in plain sight in museum drawers and private collections for well over a century, patiently waiting for the right combination of curiosity, humility, and technology to finally catch up to it. There is something deeply satisfying about a mystery like that one that was never really hiding from us at all, only waiting for us to ask better questions. Compare that for a moment to most of the extinction stories we tell each other. Usually the excitement lives entirely in the finding, a dramatic dig, a lucky strike, a skeleton pulled whole out of the ground for the first time in millions of years. This story barely has a moment like that at all. Its most dramatic turning points happen quietly in museum storerooms, in old dusty monographs nobody had opened in decades, in the careful patient work of people willing to look again at something everyone else had already decided they understood. That is a much harder story to market, if I am honest with you, and yet somehow it is the one that keeps drawing people back in generation after generation. Maybe that says something about what we actually respond to underneath all the flashier, louder stories competing for our attention. Not spectacle, persistence, the quiet, unglamorous act of simply refusing to stop asking a good question. Do you remember where we actually began tonight? Somewhere in the cold rocky hills of the Ural Mountains in the final years of the 1800s, a tired man held a strange coiled stone in his palm and had absolutely no idea what he was looking at. No name for it, no context, no way of guessing that this small unassuming object was about to occupy the careers of scientists across 3 different centuries on at least 4 different continents before anyone finally understood it properly. We watched him slip it into his coat pocket, planning to show it to someone later who might actually know what it was. He had no way of knowing that no one anywhere on Earth actually did yet. If you could somehow walk back to that exact moment, stand beside him in the failing light and simply tell him everything you now know, the buzzsaw jaw, the ratfish relatives drifting through the deep ocean today, the rolling conveyor belt bite, the giant proportions, the quiet fading before the world's worst catastrophe ever arrived, I suspect he would not believe a single word of it. And yet every part of it is true, pieced together patiently, decade after decade, by people who are willing to say I do not know, and then go looking for the answer anyway. That, I think, is the real story underneath tonight's story. Not simply a strange fish with an impossible mouth, but 114 years of human curiosity, refusing to give up on a single stubborn question. Geologists and quarry workers who mailed fossils across oceans to strangers they trusted more than their own first instincts. A scientist confident enough to publish his best guess, and humble enough to keep revising it when better evidence arrived. Other scientists decades apart willing to publicly disagree with him, and with each other, because getting it right eventually mattered more than being the one who said it first. An artist who simply refused to stop caring about an animal that was not even technically his job to study. A student who happened to be paying attention during exactly the right documentary on exactly the right evening. All of them together, slowly turning one impossible tooth into one of the most completely understood mysteries in the entire history of fossil science. If there is one thing I hope you carry with you from all of this long after tonight is over, it is something closer to a feeling than a fact. The world is still full of small, strange, overlooked objects sitting quietly in drawers, waiting patiently for someone curious enough to finally ask the right question about them. You do not need to be a professional scientist to be the kind of person who notices. Sometimes all it takes is paying a little more attention than everyone else in the room happened to be paying that particular day. I want to say a real sincere thank you for staying with this story all the way through tonight, from that cold hillside in Russia to the bottom of a permanently dark ocean, through a century of confident, well-meaning wrong guesses, all the way to a fossil finally being understood in full more than 100 years after it first confused the smartest people who ever looked at it. Stories like this take a long time to put together properly, and it means more than you probably realize that you chose to spend part of your evening here, letting an old, strange mystery settle quietly into the room with you, instead of scrolling towards something louder and easier. There are countless other things you could have been doing with this exact stretch of time tonight, and you chose this instead. That is not a small thing, and I do not take it for granted. If somewhere in all of this you found a little wonder, a little curiosity, maybe even a little comfort, then this story has done exactly what I hoped it would do. That more than anything else is the whole point of nights like this one. There are more stories like this one waiting other strange half-forgotten corners of history and nature that deserve the same kind of patient, careful attention we gave this one tonight. Other quiet mysteries sitting in other drawers in other museums, still waiting for someone curious enough to finally open them properly. If you would like to be here for the next one, settling in the same way you did tonight, staying close is the simplest way to make sure you do not miss it. No pressure, in that only an open invitation, the same way you might leave a light on for a friend you are hoping will visit again soon. For now though, let the light stay low. Let your thoughts drift and let yourself rest easy, knowing that somewhere deep in a cold, dark ocean that no longer exists, a strange, patient, spiral-toothed hunter finally got to be understood. It took 114 years, a Russian quarry, a Danish scholar, an Idaho phosphate mine, an artist, a student and a machine built for an entirely different purpose. But it happened. And now, whenever you happen to picture a shark from now on somewhere in the back of your mind, there will always be a small, strange, coiled exception, quietly reminding you that the ocean has always been stranger and more patient than we ever gave it credit for. Good night.